Maya Chen's boots hit the asphalt of the Naval Special Warfare Training Facility at 0600, the Pacific dawn casting long shadows across the equipment staging area. She wore a faded tactical vest over civilian contractor khakis, the fabric showing years of hard use in places that told stories to those who knew how to read them. The patches were worn smooth where rifle stocks had rubbed during long operations, and a custom-modified breaching tool hung from her loadout with a kind of precision placement that came from muscle memory built under fire. The equipment bay smelled like gun oil and salt air, familiar and grounding. Maya began her inventory work with the methodical focus of someone who understood that lives depended on gear functioning exactly as expected. She logged serial numbers for 43 pieces of demolition equipment, her fingers moving across the tablet with the same efficiency her hands once showed, clearing rooms in places that didn't exist on maps. 3 voices cut through her concentration before she saw their faces. The tone carried that particular blend of confidence and dismissal that young operators wore like armor before combat taught them humility. Petty Officer First Class Derek Garrett led the group, his seal trident gleaming on his chest with the shine of someone who still polished it. Behind him, Morrison and Hayes carried themselves with the casual arrogance of men who'd completed BUD/S training and believed that made them the deadliest humans on Earth. They noticed Maya's vest first, then the breaching tool, and Garrett's expression shifted from curiosity to contempt in the space of a heartbeat. "You see a lot of tactical wannabes these days," Garrett said to his companions, his voice pitched to carry across the bay. "Probably bought that vest at a surplus store and watched some YouTube videos." Maya kept her eyes on the inventory screen. She'd learned years ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, especially when the fight itself revealed information better kept classified. Her fingers continued their work, logging a set of shaped charges that needed recalibration. Morrison laughed, a sound designed to invite others into the joke. "Check out the breaching tool." But she doesn't even know which end is up. Hayes crossed his arms and leaned against a storage rack with calculated casualness. "What do you think civilians even get gear like that?" "Amazon probably has a tactical section now." The 3 men moved closer, their formation unconsciously adopting the same loose triangle they'd use approaching a target. Garrett stopped 3 feet from Maya's workstation, close enough to invade her space, but far enough to maintain deniability if challenged. His eyes scanned her vest with the kind of false expertise that came from looking at equipment catalogs rather than using tools in situations where mistakes meant body bags. "Nice costume," Garrett said directly to Maya now, abandoning the pretense of talking past her. "You a photographer or something? Here to document real operators doing real work?" Maya looked up from her tablet, meeting his eyes with the kind of calm that unnerved people expecting defensiveness or anger. She spoke with the flat precision of someone stating technical facts rather than defending personal choices. "The breaching tool is a modified MC4 with custom charge placement rails," she said. "The modifications allow for variable yield configuration without changing the primary housing. It's optimized for compound entries where wall composition is unknown and collateral concerns require precision." Garrett's smile widened, though something flickered in his eyes that suggested her response wasn't what he'd expected. He glanced back at Morrison and Hayes, performing for his audience. "Oh, she Googled some terminology," Garrett said. "Probably spent all night memorizing technical specs to sound legit." He turned back to Maya, his voice dropping into what he clearly thought was intimidating range. "Real operators don't need to explain their gear, sweetheart. They just use it. And they definitely don't work civilian contracts hauling equipment for people who actually know what they're doing." Maya returned her attention to the inventory screen without responding. The silence stretched between them, and Garrett's confidence wavered just enough that Morrison felt the need to fill the gap. "Maybe she was a mechanic in the Navy or something," Morrison offered. "Worked on equipment, but never actually deployed. Thinks that gives her operator cred." Hayes nodded his agreement with the enthusiasm of someone grateful to contribute. "Yeah, seen that before. Support personnel who want to play dress-up after they get out." act like they were door kickers when they were really just counting supplies in an air-conditioned warehouse. Through the equipment bay's high windows, Base Commander Wilson stood in his office watching the exchange unfold. He was too far away to hear the specific words, but body language told its own story. 3 active duty SEALs surrounding a civilian contractor, their postures aggressive despite the casual appearance. The woman's stillness under their attention struck him as unusual. Most civilians confronted by operators either got defensive or nervous. She showed neither response, just continued working as though the 3 men didn't exist. Wilson made a mental note to review her personnel file. Something about the situation didn't track with normal civilian contractor behavior, and his instincts suggested there was more to Maya Chun than her paperwork indicated. He'd survived 28 years in special operations by paying attention to details that didn't quite fit expected patterns, and this woman definitely qualified as a detail worth investigating. Back in the equipment bay, Garrett made one final attempt to provoke a reaction. He reached out and tapped the breaching tool hanging from Maya's vest, the contact deliberately invasive. "So where'd you really train with this fancy gear?" he asked, his finger still touching her equipment. "What unit were you supposedly with that needed modified MC-4S?" Maya's hand moved with the kind of speed that exists between thinking and action, intercepting his wrist before his finger could tap the tool a second time. Her grip was precise rather than painful, controlling the joint with minimal force. She held it for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to establish capability without escalating to assault, then released him and stepped back. "I train where I trained," she said quietly. "And you should probably get to your scheduled range time. Petty Officer Garrett, your team brief starts in 6 minutes. She knew his name despite never having been introduced. She knew his schedule despite having no official need for that information. And she'd moved with the kind of reflexive control that took thousands of hours to develop. Garrett processed these facts with growing unease, but his pride wouldn't allow him to back down in front of Morrison and Hayes. "We'll finish this conversation later," he said, trying to reclaim authority through tone, "when you're not hiding behind your civilian contractor status." The 3 men left the equipment bay with the swagger of people who believed they'd won an encounter, but Garrett glanced back once before the door closed. Maya had already returned to her inventory work, her expression unchanged, and something about her complete dismissal of him felt more threatening than if she'd risen to his challenge. Maybe you've worked with people like Maya, folks who carried quiet competence like a weapon more effective than anything holstered on their belt. Perhaps you've even been stationed somewhere similar, or maybe you're watching this from somewhere else entirely. Drop a comment and let everyone know where you're tuning in from, because understanding where real strength comes from versus where arrogance leads matters no matter what part of the country or world you call home. Maya logged the final piece of equipment and closed her tablet. The morning had started exactly as she'd expected it would. Garrett and his friends weren't the first people to mistake her civilian contractor status for weakness, and they wouldn't be the last. She'd spent 8 years in a unit that didn't officially exist, running operations that would never be declassified, and she'd learned that the most dangerous operators were always the ones that didn't need to prove anything to anyone. The breaching tool hung against her vest with comfortable weight, its modified housing containing a serial number that exactly 6 other people in the world carried. One of those people was dead, killed in the same operation where Maya had earned the tool. Another had retired and disappeared into Montana wilderness, unreachable and uninterested in past glories. The remaining 4 were still operational, scattered across classified assignments that would never make headlines. Maya touched the tool once, a brief acknowledgement of the memory it carried, then headed toward the range complex to begin her actual work. Garrett and his friends would learn or they wouldn't. Either way, she had equipment to certify and young operators to keep alive through proper training. Everything else was noise she'd learned to filter out long before most people understood that silence could be its own kind of strength. The training range coordinator pulled Maya aside at 0730 with the kind of apologetic expression that meant someone had made a decision she wouldn't like. Senior Chief Ramirez had been in Naval Special Warfare for 19 years, long enough to recognize when bureaucracy was about to create problems that common sense could have prevented. "We need you on the live breaching exercise today," Ramirez said, handing her a safety observer vest in high-visibility yellow. Equipment safety monitor for Garrett's team. They're running Building 6 scenarios with live charges. Maya accepted the vest without comment, though her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Ramirez noticed the reaction, and his apologetic expression deepened. "I know," he said quietly, "but you're the only certified monitor available, and regulations require one for live demo work. For hours, then you're clear." The range sprawled across 200 acres of coastal scrubland, with kill houses and mock compounds built to replicate every hostile architecture pattern from the last 20 years of warfare. Building 6 was a 3-story concrete structure designed to simulate Middle Eastern urban combat, with reinforced walls that required proper breaching techniques rather than the sledgehammer approaches that worked on cheaper construction. Maya arrived at the range perimeter at 0800 to find Garrett's team already staging their equipment. Morrison and Hayes were laying out shaped charges with the careful precision that BUD/S had drilled into them, while Garrett supervised with the confidence of someone who'd run this drill a dozen times. 23 other personnel occupied the observation area, a mix of instructors and students watching the exercise as part of their training rotation. Garrett saw Maya approaching in her yellow safety vest, and his expression shifted through surprise to something harder. He said nothing as she took her position at the safety line, but Morrison leaned close to whisper something that made Hayes laugh. The breaching setup took 15 minutes. Garrett's team placed charges on 3 entry points, the explosive compound molded into frames that would direct the blast inward to minimize collateral damage. Maya watched the placement with the trained eye of someone who'd set hundreds of similar charges under conditions where mistakes meant friendly casualties rather than training failures. She spotted the problem on the secondary door charge immediately. The frame sat 2 inches too high, positioned where the door's reinforcement bar would deflect most of the blast energy sideways instead of through the locking mechanism. It was the kind of mistake that happened when operators memorize procedures without understanding the underlying physics, and it would result in a failed breach that left them stacked outside a door they couldn't open while hypothetical enemies had clear shots through the walls. Maya raised her hand to signal halt, her voice carrying across the range with authority that made Garrett stop mid-motion. "Hold position," she called. "Secondary charge is misplaced." Garrett straightened from checking his primary charge, his face flushing with immediate anger. He crossed the staging area toward Maya with deliberate strides, his body language broadcasting confrontation to everyone watching. "The charge is exactly where it's supposed to be," he said when he reached the safety line. "Same placement we've used in 4 previous exercises without issues." Maya kept her voice level and technical, pointing toward the problematic charge. "The door frame has a reinforcement bar at that height. Your blast will deflect laterally instead of compromising the lock. You'll get partial yield with high probability of failed entry." Garrett's anger intensified, his chest expanding as he drew breath to respond. Morrison and Hayes had stopped their work to watch the exchange, and the observation area had gone silent with the attention of people recognizing that training was about to become something else entirely. "And where exactly did you learn about reinforcement bar placement?" Garrett demanded, his voice loud enough to ensure the entire audience heard him. "What unit trained you on breaching techniques?" "Because I don't remember seeing you in any SEAL training pipeline." The challenge hung in the air between them, explicit and hostile. 23 pairs of eyes watched Maya, waiting for her response. She'd spent 6 years in operations where the wrong word could compromise missions or endanger assets, and she chose her language now with the same precision she'd once used selecting targets. "I'm not here to discuss my training history," she said. "I'm here to ensure this exercise doesn't result in injury or equipment damage due to improper charge placement. The secondary frame needs to move down 2 inches to sit below the reinforcement point." Morrison joined Garrett at the safety line, his voice carrying the same aggressive edge. "That sounds like someone who read about breaching in a manual, but never actually blew a door in real life. We've all run Building 6 multiple times. The placement is standard. Hayes called from his position near the charges, emboldened by his teammates' confrontation. Maybe she's worried because she doesn't understand how the exercise works. Civilians see explosives and get nervous. The crowd's reactions split down predictable lines. Younger students nodded along with Garrett's challenge, their inexperience making them trust rank over expertise. The instructors maintained neutral expressions, but several shifted their weight in ways that suggested discomfort with the escalating situation. Maya stepped over the safety line and walked directly to the secondary charge, her movement precise and unhesitating. She knelt beside the frame and adjusted its position with hands that showed intimate familiarity with the equipment, dropping it exactly 2 inches and checking the alignment against the door's hidden structure with the confidence of someone who could visualize what lay beneath the surface. The charge sat in the new position with mathematical precision, its yield cone now aimed directly at the lock mechanism with optimal energy transfer. Maya stood and returned to the safety line without speaking, her demonstration eliminating the need for further argument. Garrett followed her back to the line, his face darkening as he processed the fact that she'd physically intervened in his exercise. He moved into her personal space with deliberate intimidation, close enough that his chest nearly touched hers despite the significant height difference. "You just disrespected me in front of my team and 20 other personnel," he said, his voice dropping to a threatening register. "You might be some civilian contractor who thinks she knows explosives, but I'm a naval special warfare operator who's actually used these skills in combat. Your little safety monitor vest doesn't give you authority to touch our equipment or question our methods." Maya met his aggression with the same unsettling calm she'd shown in the equipment bay, her eyes steady and her voice quiet in contrast to his volume. "I'm questioning technique that will fail the breach and potentially cause injury. That's exactly what safety monitors are authorized to do. If you want to run the charge in its original position, get approval from Senior Chief Ramirez. Otherwise, we proceed with the corrected placement." Morrison stepped closer, forming a triangle with Garrett that boxed Maya against the safety barrier. Hayes remained by the charges, but his body angled toward the confrontation, ready to join if needed. The 3 SEALs created a physical wall of intimidation, their collective presence designed to overwhelm through sheer masculine aggression. "This is stolen valor," Garrett announced loudly enough for the entire range to hear. "You talk like an operator. You wear gear like an operator, but you're just some civilian playing dress-up. I've seen it before. People who wash out of training or never even attempt it, then spend the rest of their lives pretending they were something they weren't." The accusation landed across the range like a grenade. Stolen valor was the ultimate insult in military culture, a crime that betrayed everyone who'd actually earned their credentials through blood and sacrifice. The watching students leaned forward with the hungry attention of people sensing drama, while the instructors exchanged glances that suggested they were calculating whether to intervene. Senior Chief Ramirez appeared from the control building, drawn by the raised voices and visible confrontation. He assessed the situation with quick eyes, taking in Garrett's aggressive posture, Maya's isolated position, and the crowd's rapt attention. "Everyone back to positions," Ramirez ordered, his command voice cutting through the tension. "Garrett, step back from the safety line. Chin, what's the issue with the charge placement?" Maya explained the technical problem in 3 sentences, her delivery stripped of emotion or defensiveness. Ramirez walked to the secondary charge, examined its new position, then checked something on his tablet before nodding. "Corrected placement is proper for this door configuration," he said. "Proceed with exercise as modified." Garrett opened his mouth to protest, but Ramirez fixed him with a look that had silenced argument from men far more senior than a first-class petty officer. The 3 SEALs returned to their positions, but the tension remained thick enough to taste. They ran the exercise with rigid professionalism, the charges performing exactly as Maya had predicted, the secondary door opening cleanly, while Garrett's face stayed locked in angry humiliation. When the exercise concluded, Garrett gathered his team and left the range without the usual debrief. The crowd dispersed with that particular energy of people who'd witnessed something they'd be discussing later. Senior Chief Ramirez approached Maya as she removed her safety vest, his expression troubled. "That's going to be a problem," he said quietly. "Garrett's not the type to let public correction go." Maya folded the vest with mechanical precision. "I'm aware." Ramirez watched her face, searching for something he couldn't quite identify. "You handled that charge like someone with a lot more than classroom training. But your file doesn't show any military service beyond redacted sections. I don't have clearance to read." Maya handed him the folded vest without responding to the implied question. Ramirez accepted both the vest and the silence, then made a decision that would change the trajectory of what came next. "I'm documenting the safety correction in the exercise report," he said, "and I'm copying it to Commander Wilson. He should know what happened here today." 400 yards away in his office, Commander Wilson had already added Maya Chun to his list of personnel requiring deeper investigation. Something about the woman's background didn't align with her civilian contractor status, and the pattern of confrontation forming around her suggested problems that would escalate unless someone intervened with facts rather than assumptions. He pulled her file and found exactly what Senior Chief Ramirez had described. Page after page of redacted sections that indicated classified service and operations that didn't officially exist. Wilson had enough clearance to know what those redactions typically meant, and if his growing suspicion was correct, Garrett and his friends had just made a catastrophic error in judgment about who they'd chosen to harass. The question was whether Wilson would discover the truth before the situation exploded beyond his ability to control it. Lieutenant Sarah Park had witnessed the range confrontation from the observation area, and 3 hours later, she still couldn't shake the image of Maya Chun standing utterly calm, while 3 aggressive SEALs tried to intimidate her into backing down. Park had spent 7 years in naval intelligence before transferring to personnel management, long enough to recognize when someone's reactions didn't match their supposed background. Civilian contractors getting challenged by active duty operators wasn't unusual. Civilian contractors handling that challenge with the kind of cold professionalism Maya had displayed was extremely unusual. Park pulled Maya's personnel file at 1400 hours, settling into her admin office with the intention of understanding exactly who the base had hired for equipment management. The file opened with standard information. Maya Chun, age 34, hired 6 months ago as a specialized equipment contractor with focus on demolitions and tactical gear maintenance. Prior employment listed 3 years with a private military contractor in undisclosed locations, followed by 2 years of consulting work. Education showed a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from UC San Diego. Then came the sections that made Park lean closer to her screen. Military service history showed a single line of text followed by pages of black bars where information should have been. Prior service, classified. Every assignment, every unit, every deployment, every commendation was redacted behind security classifications that Park's intelligence clearance couldn't penetrate. She'd seen classified service records before, but never anything this thoroughly scrubbed. Even special operations personnel typically showed some information in their files, unit assignments that existed on paper even if the specific mission stayed buried. Maya's file suggested someone whose entire military career had been conducted in programs that officially didn't exist. Park picked up her secure phone and dialed a former colleague at Special Operations Command Headquarters, a personnel specialist named Marcus Webb, who owed her a favor from a joint assignment 3 years back. "Webb, it's Sarah Park," she said when he answered. "I need you to check something for me off the record." Webb's sigh carried clearly through the line. "That's never a good way to start a conversation, Park. What are you into?" Park read him Maya Chen's name, social security number, and service dates. She listened to keyboard clicks as Webb accessed databases that technically required formal requests and approval chains. The clicking stopped. Webb's silence stretched long enough that Park thought the call had dropped. "Webb, you still there?" "Yeah," he said finally. His voice changed in ways that made Park's instincts flare. "I'm here, and you need to back way off this inquiry." Park sat straighter in her chair. What does that mean? It means if that's the same Maya Chan I'm looking at, you should pretend you never looked at her file and definitely never called me, Webb said. His tone carried the careful neutrality of someone choosing words for potential future review. I can't tell you anything about her service. I can tell you that if someone with her background is working at your facility, there's a reason for it, and that reason is way above your clearance level. Park processed this information, her mind racing through implications. Is she still active in some capacity? Webb's pause was answer enough. I've already said too much. Forget you called, forget her file, and for God's sake, don't let anyone harass her. That's all the guidance I can give you. The line went dead. Park sat staring at her phone, Webb's warning echoing in her mind. She called expecting clarification and received confirmation that Maya Chan was significantly more than her civilian contractor status suggested. Someone whose background made a SOCOM personnel specialist nervous wasn't just former military. She was likely someone still connected to operations that required absolute deniability. Park returned to her computer and began a different search, pulling SEAL training class rosters from 2010 to 2018, the range that would align with Maya's approximate service dates. She spent 90 minutes reviewing thousands of names, looking for any Chun in the pipeline. Nothing. No Chun in any SEAL training class. No Chun in any Naval Special Warfare Unit roster that Park could access. If Maya had been a SEAL, she would have appeared somewhere in the system. Her complete absence suggested she'd never been part of conventional Naval Special Warfare at all, which meant Maya belonged to one of the other units, the ones that recruited from multiple services and operated under authorities that made SEAL missions look transparent by comparison. Park knew enough about the special missions community to understand there were operators who existed in classified spaces, conducting operations that would never be acknowledged, building records that would stay buried for 50 years or forever. While Park conducted her investigation, Maya's name was spreading through the base on a different channel entirely. The mess hall during evening chow buzzed with versions of the range confrontation, each retelling shaped by the narrator's perspective and agenda. Garrett sat with Morrison and Hayes at their usual table, his voice carrying to neighboring groups with deliberate projection. That civilian contractor completely disrespected the team today, he said. Touched our charges without permission, questioned our methods in front of everyone, then acted like she's some kind of authority on breaching when she's probably never been downrange in her life. Morrison nodded agreement, adding details that shaded the story further from reality. She's got all this operator gear, but can't answer basic questions about her training. Classic stolen valor situation. Probably bought the stuff online and memorized some YouTube videos. Hayes contributed his own addition. Ramirez backed her up, but you know how senior chiefs are. They have to support civilians to avoid discrimination complaints, even when everyone knows the contractor is full of it. The story spread outward from their table like ripples in water, reaching groups who hadn't witnessed the actual confrontation. By the time the tale reached the far side of the mess hall, Maya had become a civilian who'd claimed to be a SEAL, challenged Garrett's expertise, and barely avoided being thrown off the base for stolen valor. Maya heard the rumors as she picked up her dinner tray, the whispered conversations that paused where she walked past tables. She'd been through similar situations before, knew that defending herself would only make the gossip intensify. The truth of her background couldn't be revealed, which meant she had to absorb whatever accusations came without response. She ate alone at a corner table, her expression neutral, while around her the story of the fake SEAL contractor grew more elaborate with each retelling. Several personnel stared at her with open hostility, their judgment already formed by second-hand accounts. Others looked away uncomfortably, uncertain what to believe but unwilling to challenge the dominant narrative. Base Commander Wilson sat in his office reviewing Senior Chief Ramirez's incident report while the mess hall gossip machine churned stories he didn't yet know existed. The report described the technical issue with precise detail, including photographs of the charge placement before and after Maya's correction. Ramirez had noted that her adjustment had been immediately correct, suggesting extensive practical experience with breaching operations. Wilson added this information to his mental file on Maya Chun. A civilian contractor who could spot explosive placement errors faster than the team running the exercise. A woman who faced aggressive confrontation from multiple SEALs without showing fear or backing down. Someone whose personnel file was almost completely redacted under classifications Wilson couldn't access despite his command position. He picked up his phone and called the base security office. "I need you to pull 6 months of access logs for civilian contractor Maya Chun," he said. "Every building entry, every secured area, every piece of equipment she's checked out. I want a pattern analysis on my desk by 0800 tomorrow." The security officer confirmed the request, and Wilson ended the call. He had enough experience with classified personnel to recognize when someone's cover story was exactly that, a story. If Maya Chan was what he suspected, then she was operating under deep cover for reasons that probably involved national security. And if that was true, Garrett and his friends were creating a problem that could have consequences none of them understood. Wilson made a second call, this time to his immediate superior at Naval Special Warfare Group 1. The conversation was brief and loaded with implications that couldn't be stated directly over unsecured lines. "We may have a situation developing with a civilian contractor," Wilson said carefully. "The kind of contractor whose background suggests she's not actually a contractor. I need guidance on how much intervention is appropriate if active duty personnel are creating friction." His superior's response was cautious. "How much friction are we talking about?" "Public confrontation, accusations of stolen valor, hostile work environment," Wilson said. "Nothing physical yet, but the trajectory suggests escalation." A long pause. Then his superior spoke with the careful precision of someone making decisions with incomplete information. "Document everything, keep the situation contained, and I'll make some calls to find out what we're actually dealing with. Don't intervene directly unless it goes physical. If this contractor is who I think she might be, there are people much higher up the chain who need to know about this situation." Wilson acknowledged the order and ended the call. He looked out his office window at the base spread below him, thinking about Maya Chen eating alone in a mess hall full of people who thought she was a fraud. If his instincts were correct, those people were making judgments based on a cover story, attacking someone who couldn't defend herself without compromising operations that extended far beyond this single installation. The question was whether the truth would emerge before Garrett pushed things past the point of no return. Wilson had seen similar situations before, young operators who confused rank with wisdom, mistaking someone's silence for weakness rather than operational necessity. He hoped Maya Chan could maintain her cover and her composure long enough for the chain of command to sort out what was actually happening. But he had a growing suspicion that hope wouldn't be enough, that this situation was building toward a confrontation that would expose truths currently buried under classifications none of them could access. Park worked late into the evening, pulling together pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite complete. Maya's redacted file, Webb's nervous warning, the range confrontation that showed expertise beyond any civilian background, the pattern of gear that suggested real operational use rather than purchased appearance. She compiled everything into an unofficial report, knowing she had no authority to investigate further, but unable to ignore what she'd found. Somewhere in the classified spaces she couldn't access was the real story of Maya Chan, and Park had a feeling that story was going to emerge whether anyone wanted it to or not. The base settled into night operations, while rumors continued spreading through barracks and workspaces, creating a narrative that had little connection to reality but tremendous power to shape what happened next. Maya Chun lay in her quarters staring at the ceiling, knowing the situation was deteriorating but unable to take any action that wouldn't compromise the very things she'd spent years protecting. Tomorrow would bring new confrontations, new challenges, and new tests of whether silence could survive against the aggressive certainty of people who thought they knew exactly who she wasn't. Lieutenant Sarah Park requested a formal equipment inventory meeting with Maya Chun at 0900, using official channels to create a paper trail for what was actually an investigation disguised as administrative procedure. She arrived at the equipment bay, carrying a tablet and a digital camera, her cover story prepared, but her real agenda focused on Maya's mysterious breaching tool. Maya looked up from a workbench covered in disassembled weapon components when Park entered, her expression neutral, but her eyes showing the wariness of someone who recognized official scrutiny when it arrived. Park kept her approach professional, explaining that the recent range incident required documentation of all specialized equipment involved in the exercise. "I need to catalog the breaching tool you were wearing during yesterday's drill," Park said, setting her tablet on the workbench. Standard procedure after any equipment-related incident report. Maya's hesitation lasted exactly 2 seconds before she unclipped the modified MC4 from her tactical vest and placed it on the workbench between them. The tool gleamed under the fluorescent lights, its custom modifications immediately visible to anyone who understood demolition's work. The housing showed precision machining far beyond standard military issue, with charge placement rails that allowed for variable configuration without tool changes. Park photographed the device from multiple angles, her training in intelligence analysis kicking in as she documented details that might prove significant later. The modifications weren't just professional, they were exotic, representing engineering solutions to problems that only arose in very specific operational contexts. She zoomed in on a serial number stamped into the base housing, the format unlike any military equipment code she'd seen before. "Can you tell me about these modifications?" Park asked, keeping her voice casual. "They're not standard issue." Maya's response was measured, each word chosen carefully. The modifications optimize the tool for compound entries where wall composition varies. The variable yield system allows adjustment without changing equipment mid-operation. Park nodded as though satisfied with this technical explanation, but her mind was already racing ahead. She pulled out her phone and sent the serial number photograph to Master Chief John Dalton, an explosives ordnance specialist she'd worked with during her intelligence posting. Dalton had 30 years in special operations demolitions and knew every piece of equipment the military had ever fielded. His response came back in 4 minutes. Park's phone buzzed, and she glanced at the message while maintaining her professional interview posture with Maya. "Where did you get this photo?" "Those modifications were experimental, only issued to one unit for one operation back in 2015. I thought all those tools were either destroyed or locked in a vault somewhere." "Who has this?" Park looked up from her phone to find Maya watching her with that same unsettling calm, clearly aware that the lieutenant had just learned something significant. The moment stretched between them, loaded with implications neither woman could state directly. "The experimental modifications," Park said carefully. "Were they effective?" Maya's eyes flickered with something that might have been dark humor. "The operators who carried them completed their mission. Not all of them came back, but the tools performed as designed." Park made a note on her tablet, buying time to process what Maya had just revealed. The phrasing was specific and telling. Not all of them came back meant casualties. The operators who carried them meant Maya was one of those operators, not someone who'd acquired the tools secondhand. And the tools performed as designed carried the weight of combat experience rather than training exercises. "I need to document the serial number," Park said, pivoting to her official reason for being there. "Is there any paperwork showing chain of custody from when you acquired this equipment?" Maya shook her head slightly. "Anything related to initial issue is classified above my authorization to discuss. I have current documentation showing I own the tool legally as personal property acquired during service, but the specifics of that service can't be disclosed." Park had expected this answer, but hearing it confirmed strengthened her growing certainty that Maya's background extended far beyond anything in her official file. She finished photographing the breaching tool, and Maya returned it to her vest with practiced efficiency, the motion showing thousands of repetitions built into muscle memory. After Park left the equipment bay, she walked directly to a private conference room and called Dalton on a secure line. The Master Chief answered immediately, his voice sharp with curiosity. "Talk to me about that photo," he demanded. "Where did that tool come from?" "It belongs to a civilian contractor working at this base," Park said. "Her military service file is almost completely redacted. She carries that tool as personal equipment. Dalton's long silence spoke volumes. Finally, he said, "Those modifications were designed by a specialized engineering team for a joint operation in Karachi, 2015. SEL unit mission, extremely classified. 7 operators went in carrying those tools. The operation went sideways, 2 operators died, and the surviving 5 became ghosts in the system. If your contractor has one of those tools, she was either on that mission or she acquired it from someone who was." Park felt pieces clicking into place. Maya would have been approximately 24 years old in 2015, the right age for an operator in that time frame. The unit meant Delta Force or one of the other Army Special Missions units that recruited women for certain operations. A joint SEL unit mission would explain why Maya's name didn't appear in any Naval Special Warfare rosters. "Do you know the names of the operators on that mission?" Park asked. Dalton's response came carefully. "I know some of them, but if I'm right about which operation this was, those names are still classified. I can tell you the mission commander was a SEAL captain named James Keller, and he's now a rear admiral. If your contractor really has one of those tools, Keller would recognize it immediately." Park thanked Dalton and ended the call, her mind already calculating next steps. A rear admiral who'd commanded the operation that issued Maya's equipment. A tool that only 7 people had carried, 5 of whom survived. A contractor whose entire service record was redacted behind classifications that made a SOCOM personnel specialist nervous. While Park conducted her investigation, the harassment of Maya Chan was escalating in ways that would have immediate consequences. Garrett had spent the morning spreading his stolen valor narrative to anyone who would listen, and by noon his campaign had generated enough momentum that he felt emboldened to take more direct action. Maya was conducting a routine equipment check in the main storage bay when Garrett entered with Morrison and Hayes. The 3 SEALs moved through the space with deliberate noise, their voices loud and their movements designed to dominate the environment. Maya continued her inventory work without acknowledging their presence. Garrett walked past her workstation, and his elbow caught the edge of her tactical vest where it hung on a nearby rack. The vest fell to the concrete floor, the breaching tool clanging against the ground with a sound that drew attention from other personnel in the bay. Maya looked up from her tablet, her expression unchanged. "Oops," Garrett said, his tone making it clear the action had been intentional. "Sorry about that. These civilian contractor areas get so cluttered, hard to move around without knocking stuff over." Morrison laughed on cue, while Hayes made a show of examining some equipment on the far side of the bay. 3 other contractors and 2 junior enlisted personnel watched the exchange with varying degrees of discomfort, but no one intervened. Maya set down her tablet and picked up her vest, checking the breaching tool for damage with hands that showed no tremor despite the obvious provocation. The tool had survived worse than a 4-foot drop, but her careful inspection sent a message that Garrett's action had been noted and cataloged. "You should be more careful with that costume gear," Garrett continued, positioning himself where his voice would carry. "Wouldn't want anyone thinking you don't take care of equipment properly. Real operators treat their gear like their lives depend on it, because their lives actually do depend on it." The jab was clear. Garrett was implying Maya wasn't a real operator while simultaneously mocking her care for equipment. Morrison moved closer, adding his voice to the harassment campaign. "You know what I heard?" Morrison said, addressing Garrett, but speaking loud enough for the entire bay. "I heard some civilians buy legit military gear at auctions and estate sales, then wear it around pretending they earned it themselves. Isn't that wild? Like, who does that?" Hayes called from across the bay, his timing coordinated with his teammates. "I bet you could buy a tool just like that online. Probably marketed to wannabes who want to look tactical for their Instagram photos." The 3 men had refined their harassment into a coordinated performance, each contributing elements that built on the others to create maximum humiliation while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. To an outside observer who didn't understand the context, they were just talking among themselves. To Maya and everyone else in the bay, they were conducting a public character assassination. Maya returned the vest to its rack and picked up her tablet without responding. Her silence seemed to frustrate Garrett, who'd clearly expected some reaction he could use to escalate further. He moved directly into her workspace, close enough that she had to shift position to maintain distance. "So where did you really get that gear?" he asked, dropping any pretense of talking past her. "Because we both know you didn't earn it through service. Real operators don't work civilian contracts. Real operators either stay in or they get out and go private sector with real companies. They don't show up at training bases wearing tactical vests and pretending they know things they don't." Maya met his eyes with that same calm that unnerved him, and when she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the bay. "I've never claimed to be a SEAL, Petty Officer Garrett. Not once. You've made that accusation repeatedly, but I've never made that claim." The precision of her response caught Garrett off guard. She was right, technically. She'd never explicitly said she was a SEAL. But her gear, her knowledge, her bearing all suggested special operations background, and Garrett had filled in the gaps with his own assumptions. Morrison tried to recover his teammates' momentum. "You don't have to say it directly. Wearing that gear, acting like you know more than active-duty operators, correcting people on techniques, that's making the claim without words. That's stolen valor, even if you're careful about what you actually say." Park appeared in the equipment bay doorway, drawn by reports of another confrontation. She took in the scene immediately. 3 SEALs surrounding Maya, their body language aggressive, several witnesses watching with expressions ranging from hostility to discomfort. Park's arrival changed the dynamic instantly, introducing official observation that made continued harassment risky. "Is there a problem here?" Park asked, her lieutenant's authority clear despite being junior to Senior Chief Ramirez, who technically supervised this space. Garrett pivoted smoothly, his expression shifting to professional innocence. "No problem, ma'am. Just discussing equipment standards with the contractor." Park's eyes moved between Garrett and Maya, reading volumes in Maya's controlled posture and the SEAL's too casual positioning. She made a decision that would accelerate everything that came next. "Chun, I need you to come with me," Park said. "We have additional documentation requirements for your equipment inventory." Maya followed Park out of the bay, leaving Garrett and his friends to exchange looks of satisfaction. They believed they were winning, pushing the fake contractor closer to breaking or leaving. What they didn't know was that Park had just connected Maya's breaching tool to a classified operation commanded by an admiral who would be visiting the base in exactly 41 hours. The collision between their harassment campaign and the truth about Maya Chen's background was now inevitable, and the impact would destroy everything Garrett thought he understood about who he'd chosen to target. The notification arrived at Commander Wilson's desk at 1300 hours, marked with the kind of administrative formality that indicated someone important wanted advance warning properly documented. Rear Admiral James Keller would conduct an inspection tour of the Naval Special Warfare Training Facility in 48 hours, arriving Friday morning at 0800 with a small staff and remaining through 1600. Wilson read the notification twice, his instincts telling him the timing wasn't coincidental. He'd sent his inquiry about Maya Chen up the chain 36 hours ago, and now one of the most decorated SEAL commanders in modern history was making an unscheduled visit to a training facility that normally rated attention from officers several ranks below admiral. He pulled Keller's service record, though he already knew the highlights. 3 decades in naval special warfare, multiple combat deployments, commander of SEAL team operations during the height of Middle Eastern conflicts. The classified sections of his record were extensive, suggesting command of operations that would never be publicly acknowledged. Keller had made Rear Admiral 2 years ago and now oversaw significant portions of naval special warfare operational planning. Wilson cross-referenced Keller's service dates with what little information Maya Chen's file contained. The timeline overlapped perfectly. If Maya had been part of Joint SEAL operations during 2014-2016, Keller would have been commanding officer level during that period. Wilson made notes on his tablet, his suspicion hardening into near certainty that this inspection visit was actually about Maya Chen, though official channels would never state that directly. Lieutenant Park reached the same conclusion from a different angle. She'd spent the morning researching Keller after Master Chief Dalton mentioned his name in connection with the Karachi operation. When the inspection notification crossed her desk through normal administrative channels, she immediately understood that pieces were moving on a board far above her rank. She found Commander Wilson in his office at 1400, carrying a folder she'd assembled overnight. Wilson waved her in and closed the door, his expression indicating he'd been expecting this conversation. "The Admiral's visit isn't routine," Park said without preamble. "It's about Chen." Wilson nodded slowly. "Tell me what you've learned." Park laid out her investigation findings methodically. Maya's redacted service file, the experimental breaching tool issued only for a 2015 Karachi operation, the SOCOM personnel specialist's nervous warning, the lack of any Chun in SEAL training rosters, the timeline that placed Maya at the right age for that mission. She finished by showing Wilson the photograph of Maya's breaching tool with its distinctive serial number. Master Chief Dalton confirmed these tools were issued to exactly 7 operators for a joint SL unit mission commanded by then-Captain Keller, Park said. 5 operators survived. If Chun has this tool, she was either on that mission or acquired it from someone who was. And given her demonstrated expertise, I believe she was there. Wilson studied the photograph, his mind calculating implications. A unit operator, not a SEAL. That explained why her name didn't appear in Naval Special Warfare records. It also explained the extensive redactions in her file and why his superiors had reacted so carefully to his inquiry. Unit operators, especially female operators who worked classified missions, existed in spaces that made conventional special operations look transparent. Does Garrett know any of this? Wilson asked. Park shook her head. He's convinced she's a fake. The harassment has escalated to physical intimidation and public accusations. 3 incidents in the last 2 days, multiple witnesses, and Chen won't defend herself because doing so would require disclosing classified information. Wilson made a decision that would determine how the next 48 hours unfolded. He picked up his secure phone and called his contact at Naval Special Warfare Group 1, the same superior he'd spoken with earlier. "The Admiral's visit," Wilson said when his superior answered. "It's about Chun, isn't it?" A long pause, then carefully chosen words. "The Admiral has interest in ensuring that certain personnel at your facility are being treated appropriately. I'm told he has personal knowledge of some contractors' backgrounds that isn't available through normal channels." Translation: Keller knew exactly who Maya Chan was and had arranged this inspection specifically to address her situation. Wilson acknowledged the information and ended the call, then turned back to Park. Keller commanded the operation that issued Chen's equipment. He told her, "He'll recognize that tool immediately. The question is whether we let this situation continue for 2 more days until he arrives, or whether we intervene now to prevent further escalation." Park considered the options. If we intervene without authority to reveal Chen's actual background, Garrett will see it as proof that command is protecting a fake. He'll escalate further, possibly pushing things to physical confrontation. And if we don't intervene, Wilson finished the thought, Chun continues absorbing harassment she can't defend against, and the situation may explode before Keller arrives to set the record straight. While Wilson and Park debated intervention strategies, Garrett was organizing what he considered a decisive demonstration of Maya's fraudulent status. He'd learned through the base grapevine about Keller's upcoming visit and saw opportunity rather than danger. In his mind, having a rear admiral present when he exposed Maya's stolen valor would validate his accusations at the highest level. He gathered Morrison and Hayes in the barracks at 1500, laying out a plan that revealed how completely he'd misread the situation. "Tomorrow afternoon, there's a demonstration exercise scheduled for Keller's visit," Garrett said. "Building 7 breaching scenarios with live charges. I've requested Chan be assigned as equipment specialist for the demonstration." Morrison grinned with anticipation. "You're going to challenge her technical knowledge in front of an admiral?" "Better than that," Garrett said. "I'm going to set up a scenario that requires explaining specialized breaching techniques, then publicly demonstrate that she can't answer questions any real operator would know. When she fails in front of Keller, it'll force command to investigate her background formally. No more protection from her civilian contractor status." Hayes looked uncertain for the first time. What if she actually does know the answers? She's been right about technical stuff before. Garrett's confidence was absolute. She's been lucky, guessing based on things she read online. But I'll ask questions about operational decision-making, about how techniques work in actual combat rather than training scenarios. That's where frauds always break down, because you can't Google what it actually feels like to breach under fire. The three SEALs refined their plan, choreographing questions and setups designed to expose Maya in front of the highest-ranking officer who would ever visit the facility. They believed they were protecting Naval Special Warfare's integrity by removing a stolen valor contractor. What they were actually doing was constructing an elaborate trap that would spring on them instead of their intended target. Maya learned about the demonstration assignment at 1600 through a terse email from the training coordinator. She read it twice, recognizing the pattern. Garrett had specifically requested her presence, which meant he was planning another public confrontation. But this time a rear admiral would be watching, and Maya felt the first real tension she'd experienced since arriving at the base 6 months ago. She knew James Keller by reputation and brief interaction during the Karachi operation. He'd been the SEAL team commander, while she'd operated with a unit element that provided specialized capabilities for the mission. They'd spoken maybe 20 words to each other during the actual operation, but he'd personally handed her the modified breaching tool after the mission concluded, a gesture recognizing her role in a success that cost 2 operators their lives. If Keller was coming to this facility, it wasn't coincidental. Someone had flagged her situation, and he'd arranged this visit to address it. The question was whether his intervention would help or make things worse. Having her background exposed meant ending her current assignment and possibly compromising ongoing operations that relied on her maintaining civilian contractor cover. Maya sat in her quarters that evening, the breaching tool disassembled on her desk for routine maintenance. She cleaned each component with practiced efficiency, her hands performing familiar motions while her mind calculated probabilities. Garrett was going to push things to a crisis point tomorrow. Keller was going to be present when it happened, and Maya would have to decide in real time whether to maintain her cover or reveal truths that would cascade through multiple operational channels. Commander Wilson issued orders at 1800 that would shape the next day's events. He assigned Lieutenant Park as official observer for the demonstration exercise, giving her authority to document everything that occurred. He also quietly placed 2 Master at Arms personnel in positions where they could respond quickly if the confrontation turned physical. Finally, he sent a secure message to his superiors indicating that he expected a significant incident during the Admiral's visit and had taken appropriate precautionary measures. The base settled into evening routine while multiple people prepared for a collision they understood would be significant, but whose full implications none of them could predict. Garrett refined his questions, confident in his ability to expose Maya's fraud. Park reviewed her investigation file, knowing that Keller's recognition of Maya's equipment would vindicate everything she'd suspected. Wilson updated contingency plans, hoping to maintain control of a situation that was rapidly exceeding his authority to manage. And Maya cleaned her breaching tool, each motion a meditation on the costs of service and the price of silence. She'd survived missions that officially never happened, carried out operations that would never be acknowledged, and built a record that would stay classified for decades. Tomorrow she would face judgment from people who thought they understood what service meant, but had never operated in the spaces where she'd spent years. The modified MC4 gleamed under her desk lamp, its serial number catching the light like an accusation or a badge of honor, depending on who read it. Maya reassembled the tool with smooth efficiency, then returned it to her vest where it hung with the comfortable weight of truth that couldn't be spoken but could never be erased. Friday morning would bring Admiral Keller, Garrett's planned confrontation, and a reckoning that would force classified truths into spaces that depended on plausible deniability. The only question remaining was how much damage would occur before those truths emerged, and whether any of the people involved would understand what they'd actually witnessed when silence finally broke. Rear Admiral James Keller's vehicle arrived at the Naval Special Warfare Facility at 07:55, exactly 5 minutes ahead of schedule in the way that senior officers use punctuality as a weapon against unprepared subordinates. Commander Wilson met him at the main entrance with full military courtesy. But Keller's attention swept past the welcoming committee to scan the facility with eyes that missed nothing. The Admiral was 53 years old and carried himself with the compact efficiency of someone who'd spent 3 decades in special operations. His uniform bore the trident, multiple combat ribbons, and shoulder patches that documented a career most operators only dreamed about. But it was his expression that caught Wilson's attention, a focused intensity that suggested this visit had specific purpose beyond routine inspection. "Commander Wilson," Keller said, returning the salute with practiced precision, "I appreciate the accommodation on short notice. I understand you have a demonstration exercise scheduled for this afternoon?" Wilson confirmed the schedule, watching Keller's reaction carefully. The Admiral nodded, as though this was new information, but Wilson had enough experience reading senior officers to recognize performance. Keller knew exactly what was scheduled because he'd arranged his visit to coincide with it. The morning inspection tour proceeded with military efficiency. Keller examined training facilities, reviewed equipment maintenance logs, and spoke with instructors about current curriculum. His staff took notes and photographs, documenting everything with a thoroughness that made these visits valuable regardless of underlying agenda. But Wilson noticed that Keller's questions kept circling back to equipment management protocols and civilian contractor integration. At 1100 hours, Keller requested a private meeting with Wilson in the commander's office. The staff was dismissed and the door closed, leaving the two officers alone in a conversation that would never appear in any official report. "Tell me about your equipment specialist, Maya Chun," Keller said without preamble. Wilson had prepared for this question. He provided a summary of Maya's performance, the harassment situation, and Park's investigation findings. Keller listened without interrupting, his expression neutral until Wilson mentioned the modified breaching tool with its distinctive serial number. "May I see the photograph?" Keller asked. Wilson pulled up Park's image on his tablet and handed it to the Admiral. Keller studied the photograph for 30 seconds, his thumb tracing across the screen where the modifications were visible. When he looked up, his eyes carried weight that made Wilson understand how completely Garrett had miscalculated. That tool was issued to 7 operators for Operation Phantom Reach in Karachi, March 2015, Keller said quietly. "Joint SEAL Unit mission. I commanded the SEAL element. The mission went sideways when our intelligence on the compound proved inaccurate. We lost 2 operators, both SEALs, in the first 60 seconds. The unit element, including Chun, saved the mission and probably saved the rest of my team." Wilson absorbed this information, pieces clicking into place with finality. "Chun is unit," he stated rather than asked. Keller nodded. "Delta Force, specialized in technical operations. She was 24 years old on that mission and performed like a veteran. After Phantom Reach, she deployed to 3 more classified operations before rotating out. Her service record will stay sealed for 50 years, but she earned every piece of gear she carries." The Admiral's voice carried steel underneath professional calm. "I gave her that breaching tool myself after the mission. All 7 operators received them, custom-made to commemorate what we accomplished and honor what we lost. 5 of us survived. If Petty Officer Garrett has been accusing her of stolen valor while she wears that tool, he's made an error that requires correction." Wilson understood that correction in this context meant career-ending consequences. He explained the planned demonstration exercise, Garrett's intention to expose Maya publicly, and the precautions Wilson had implemented. Keller listened with growing anger held under rigid control. "Let the demonstration proceed as scheduled," Keller said finally. "I want to see exactly how far this has gone, but have Lieutenant Park document everything and make sure your Master at Arms personnel are positioned to intervene if necessary." At 1300 hours, the demonstration area began filling with personnel. Garrett had spread word that Admiral Keller would observe their exercise, ensuring maximum attendance. 37 people gathered in the observation zone, including instructors, students, and administrative staff. A Navy public affairs photographer documented the event for official records, her camera capturing what would become evidence of the day Garrett's harassment campaign collapsed. Maya arrived at 13:15, wearing her tactical vest with the breaching tool prominently displayed. She saw Keller immediately, his admiral's uniform impossible to miss, and their eyes met across the demonstration area for exactly 2 seconds. His expression gave nothing away, but Maya recognized the assessment in his gaze. He was evaluating the situation before deciding how to respond. Lieutenant Park positioned herself near the observer area with her tablet, officially documenting the exercise, but actually preparing to record everything about the confrontation she knew was coming. Commander Wilson stood beside Keller, providing context about the training facility while watching Garrett's team prepare their demonstration with growing apprehension. Garrett moved through setup procedures with confidence that bordered on arrogance. He'd rehearsed his planned questions, coordinated his team's responses, and positioned himself to maximum advantage for the public confrontation. Morrison and Hayes worked the equipment with exaggerated precision, their performance designed to highlight their SEAL credentials against Maya's suspected fraud. Building 7 was a 3-story structure designed to replicate high-value target compounds, with reinforced doors, varied wall construction, and sight lines that punished poor technique. Garrett's team would demonstrate breaching procedures on 3 different entry points, each requiring technical knowledge and operational decision-making. He'd engineered the demonstration to create moments where Maya would be expected to comment or answer questions, setting up his trap with careful planning. At 13:30, Garrett briefed the exercise for Keller's benefit. He explained the building layout, the training objectives, and the equipment protocols with the smooth confidence of someone who'd done this before. Then he introduced Maya as the equipment specialist who would monitor safety and provide technical expertise, his phrasing loaded with subtle mockery that his friends caught, but that sounded professional to uninformed observers. "Admiral Keller," Garrett said with formal respect, "our contractor, Ms. Chun, has extensive knowledge of demolitions equipment and has been providing valuable consultation on our training procedures. She'll be observing today to ensure we maintain proper safety protocols." Maya stood at the designated monitoring position, her expression neutral, while Garrett's introduction painted her as a civilian consultant rather than someone with her own operational background. Keller's eyes moved between Garrett and Maya, reading dynamics that the petty officer couldn't see. The demonstration began with primary door breaching. Garrett's team placed charges with textbook precision, their movements synchronized and professional. The controlled explosion blew the door cleanly, exactly as intended. Observers nodded approval, and the photographer captured the successful breach for official records. Garrett turned to Maya, beginning his planned interrogation. "Ms. Chun, from a technical perspective, what factors determine optimal charge placement for that door configuration?" Maya answered concisely, describing load-bearing analysis, blast direction calculations, and structural considerations. Her response was technically perfect, based on both theoretical knowledge and practical experience. Garrett's smile tightened slightly, his first question failing to expose any weakness. He escalated to the secondary breach, a reinforced door that required modified technique. His team set up the charges, and Garrett continued his questioning, pushing into operational decision-making rather than pure technical knowledge. In combat situations where time is critical and intelligence is incomplete, how do operators balance speed against the risk of improper charge placement? He asked, his tone suggesting this was a question only experienced operators could answer properly. Maya's response came without hesitation. Operators fall back on training patterns and trust team coordination. Primary breacher sets based on visual assessment and experience recognition. Secondary breacher validates placement during final approach. If there's disagreement, team leader makes the call based on mission priority versus acceptable risk threshold. Her answer reflected operational experience rather than academic knowledge. Several instructors in the observation area exchanged glances, recognizing the depth of practical understanding in her response. Garrett's confidence wavered as he realized his questions were backfiring, revealing Maya's expertise rather than exposing fraud. Morrison jumped in with his own question, trying to support his teammate. What about situations where the breach fails and operators are exposed during secondary attempt? How does that change tactical approach? Maya turned to face Morrison directly. Failed breach means your position is compromised and you're stacked against a door you can't open, while hostiles have firing positions through walls or from upper floors. Standard response is immediate extract or shift to alternate entry if available. Never stay exposed attempting to fix a failed breach under fire. The specificity of her answer, the casual use of operational terminology, and the underlying assumption of personal experience made several observers reconsider their earlier judgments about her background. Park documented every exchange, watching Garrett's growing frustration as Maya answered each question with the authority of someone who'd actually faced these situations. Keller remained silent throughout the demonstration, his expression unreadable, but his attention completely focused on Maya. He'd recognized her immediately when she arrived, though 9 years and different contexts made the connection less obvious than the breaching tool would prove. Now he listened to her answers and understood exactly what Garrett had done by challenging someone whose operational experience exceeded everyone present except possibly the Admiral himself. Garrett made one final attempt, abandoning his technical questions for direct confrontation. Ms. Chun, you speak with considerable authority about combat breaching procedures. Can you tell the Admiral specifically where you gained this experience? What unit? What deployments? The question hung in the air like an armed explosive. Everyone in the observation area understood that Garrett had just demanded Maya reveal information she'd been protecting throughout months of harassment. Park's fingers hovered over her tablet, ready to document whatever came next. Wilson tensed, preparing to intervene if the situation exceeded bounds. Maya met Garrett's eyes with that same unsettling calm, and when she spoke, her voice carried across the demonstration area with absolute clarity. I'm not authorized to discuss my service history in this setting, Petty Officer Garrett. Those details are classified above both our clearance levels. Garrett's expression shifted to triumph. He believed Maya's refusal confirmed his stolen valor accusation. He turned toward Keller, ready to make his case to the Admiral that this contractor's evasiveness proved fraud. But before he could speak, Keller stepped forward from the observation line. Admiral Keller moved from the observation line with deliberate steps that carried command authority built through 3 decades of leading men in combat. The demonstration area fell silent as he approached, 37 people recognizing that rank was about to intervene in what had been shaping into a confrontation between enlisted personnel and a civilian contractor. Garrett's moment of triumph collapsed under the Admiral's advance. He'd expected to make his case to Keller from a distance, presenting evidence of Maya's evasiveness as proof of fraud. Instead, Keller was walking directly toward Maya with an expression that suggested personal interest rather than detached evaluation. Ms. Chun, Keller said when he reached her position. May I examine your breaching tool? The request was professionally phrased, but carried undertones that made Commander Wilson tense. Maya unclipped the modified MC4 from her vest and handed it to the Admiral without hesitation. Their exchange smooth with the ease of people who'd handled sensitive equipment together before. Keller held the tool with familiar reverence, his fingers tracing modifications that most observers couldn't distinguish from standard military issue. He turned the housing to catch light on the serial number, his expression shifting through recognition into something harder. His thumb ran across the custom charge placement rails, feeling engineering solutions designed for specific operational problems. The observation area watched in complete silence as the Admiral conducted his examination, everyone sensing that this moment would determine outcomes beyond the immediate demonstration. Keller looked up from the tool to meet Maya's eyes, and his next words detonated across the demonstration area with more force than any shaped charge. Karachi, 2015? Maya's response came quietly but clearly. Building 7, sir. 3rd floor. The exchange lasted 4 seconds and conveyed information that bypassed everyone except the two people who'd been present for events that officially never happened. Garrett's face drained of color as he processed that the Admiral and Maya shared operational history, that his stolen valor accusation had just been revealed as catastrophically wrong. Morrison and Hayes exchanged panicked glances, understanding that they participated in harassing someone whose background was validated by a rear admiral's personal recognition. Keller's demeanor transformed completely. He handed the breaching tool back to Maya with careful respect, then turned to face the observation area. His voice carried the command authority that made entire SEAL teams snap to attention, and every person present felt the weight of his words before he even spoke them. This tool was issued to exactly 7 operators for Operation Phantom Reach in March 2015, Keller announced. The mission was a joint SL unit operation targeting a high-value compound in Karachi. The modifications you see were custom designed to solve specific technical problems we encountered during mission planning. Only those 7 operators carry this particular configuration, and only those operators know the precise purpose of each modification. He paused, letting the information settle across an audience that was rapidly recalculating everything they thought they knew about Maya Chun. Garrett stood frozen in place, his planned exposure collapsing into public humiliation. Park's tablet captured every moment, documenting the reversal with clinical precision. I personally handed these tools to each operator after mission completion, Keller continued. 5 operators survived that mission. 2 SEALs died in the initial breach when our intelligence proved inaccurate. The unit element, including Ms. Chun, adjusted tactics in real time and salvaged what became a strategic success at significant cost. The silence stretched across the demonstration area like physical pressure. Garrett wanted to speak, to defend himself, to explain that he hadn't known, but no words could change what he'd done or undo months of harassment against someone who'd carried operational credentials he would never achieve. Keller's expression hardened further. Ms. Chun isn't a SEAL, he stated flatly. She's something else entirely, and her service record will remain classified for approximately 50 years. But I can tell you that her operational experience includes 4 classified deployments, multiple direct action missions, and technical expertise that contributed to strategic-level successes. Morrison made a small sound that might have been a protest or simply shock escaping under pressure. Hayes had gone completely pale, staring at Maya as though seeing her for the first time. The other observers showed varying reactions, from stunned realization to uncomfortable recognition that they'd witnessed or participated in mistreating a veteran whose credentials exceeded everyone present. Garrett finally found his voice, though it emerged weak and uncertain. Sir, I didn't know. Her file is redacted and she never claimed SEAL status, but her gear and knowledge suggested special operations background, and I thought. Keller cut him off with glacial precision. You thought you could determine someone's service credentials through appearance and assumption rather than actual knowledge. You spent months harassing a contractor who couldn't defend herself without compromising classified operations. And you organized this demonstration specifically to expose her publicly in front of the highest-ranking officer who would ever visit this facility. Each sentence landed like a physical blow. Garrett's face reflected growing horror as he understood the full magnitude of his error. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding that could be explained away. He'd conducted a sustained campaign against someone whose actual background made his SEAL credentials look modest by comparison, and he'd done it with witnesses, documentation, and now an admiral's personal testimony about his target's legitimacy. Keller turned back to Maya, his tone shifting from command authority to something approaching apology. I wish your assignment here had gone differently. You shouldn't have had to endure months of accusations you couldn't answer. But operational security required maintaining your cover, and I understand you held that cover despite significant provocation. Maya's response was characteristically minimal. The mission required it, sir. The phrase carried layers of meaning that Keller understood completely. Operators maintained cover even under harassment because operational security superseded personal comfort. They absorbed accusations they couldn't refute because classified information stayed classified regardless of cost. They endured public judgment because the missions mattered more than individual reputation. Keller addressed the observation area one final time, his voice carrying implications that would shape multiple careers. I want formal investigation into the harassment of Ms. Chun, complete documentation of all incidents, and appropriate consequences for personnel who participated in creating a hostile work environment. Commander Wilson, you'll coordinate with Lieutenant Park, who I understand has already compiled significant evidence. Wilson stepped forward with a sharp affirmative, recognizing orders that came from someone who'd already coordinated this intervention through proper channels. Park's investigation would now become official inquiry backed by an admiral's direct interest, transforming what had been careful documentation into career-ending evidence. Garrett made one final desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. Sir, if I'd known her actual background, I would never have questioned her credentials. The redactions in her file made it impossible to verify her service, and I was trying to protect the integrity of naval special warfare from stolen valor. Keller's response destroyed any remaining ground Garrett stood on. The integrity of naval special warfare includes respecting all special operations personnel regardless of which service or unit they served with. It includes understanding that some operators can't reveal their backgrounds for legitimate security reasons. And it absolutely includes not conducting harassment campaigns against veterans who've sacrificed more than you can imagine because they wear their experience quietly rather than broadcasting it. The Admiral's words carried finality that made further protest impossible. Garrett stood exposed, not just as wrong, but as fundamentally failing to understand what service actually meant. Morrison and Hayes recognized their own culpability in his condemnation, understanding that their participation in the harassment campaign would appear in the formal investigation Keller had just ordered. The demonstration area emptied quickly as personnel dispersed to process what they'd witnessed. Some observers approached Maya with awkward apologies or expressions of respect, their earlier judgments reversed by Keller's testimony. Others avoided eye contact entirely, embarrassed by their participation in or tolerance of Garrett's campaign. The photographer continued documenting everything, her images capturing the aftermath of a confrontation that had reversed with devastating completeness. Park remained behind with Wilson and Keller, the three officers forming a tight group near the demonstration building. Maya stood at distance, giving them space for conversation she wasn't meant to hear but could easily imagine. They were discussing investigation parameters, consequence structures, and how to prevent similar situations with other classified personnel working in unacknowledged capacities. Garrett, Morrison, and Hayes walked toward the barracks in shell-shocked silence, their futures collapsing with each step. Everything they'd built over years of training and service was compromised by months of harassing someone they'd misjudged completely. The formal investigation would document their actions with clinical precision, creating permanent records that would follow them regardless of final adjudication. Maya returned the breaching tool to her vest, the familiar weight settling against her ribs like validation she hadn't needed, but appreciated nonetheless. Keller's intervention had ended the harassment and vindicated her background, but it had also exposed her cover and likely ended her current assignment. She'd maintained operational security until external authority forced the revelation, which meant she'd completed her mission even if the mission was now finished. The sun dropped toward the Pacific horizon while the base processed implications that would reshape multiple careers and force institutional reconsideration of how they treated personnel with classified backgrounds. Garrett's harassment campaign had started with assumptions about who deserved respect based on visible credentials. It ended with an admiral confirming that the quietest operator in the facility carried experience that exceeded everyone who doubted her. Maya walked back toward the equipment bay alone, her tactical vest worn and faded, but now recognized for what it actually was: gear earned through operations that officially never happened and validated by someone who'd witnessed her performance under fire. The demonstration area emptied behind her, while ahead lay conversations about reassignment, operational security protocols, and whether her cover could be reconstructed or if this chapter of her service had reached its natural conclusion. Keller watched her go, remembering a 24-year-old operator who'd saved his team in Karachi 9 years ago. She walked with the same efficient economy of movement, still carrying silence like a weapon, still demonstrating that the most dangerous operators were always the ones who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He'd ended the harassment and vindicated her credentials, but he understood that operational necessity might still demand her silence about specifics that would remain classified long after everyone involved was dead. Admiral Keller requested private conversation with Maya Chun at 1600 hours, pulling her into a small conference room away from the observation and speculation that now followed her everywhere on base. Commander Wilson attended as required protocol, but positioned himself at respectful distance to allow the two operators their discussion without excessive oversight. Keller settled into a chair across from Maya, with the tired posture of someone who'd spent the day managing consequences rather than simply observing training. His uniform remained perfectly pressed, but his expression carried weight that came from making decisions that would alter multiple careers. "I need to apologize," he began without preamble. "Your assignment here required maintaining cover, and my intervention today destroyed that cover completely. I consulted with your chain of command before making the trip, and we determined that ending the harassment took priority over preserving your contractor status. But I know that decision affects your operational utility going forward." Maya's response was characteristically direct. The harassment was escalating toward physical confrontation. Another week, and the situation would have forced revelation regardless of your intervention. You simply controlled how and when the truth emerged rather than allowing it to explode unmanaged. Keller nodded, accepting her assessment. He pulled a tablet from his briefcase and opened files that showed the investigation Lieutenant Park had been conducting. The documentation was extensive, spanning 6 months of incidents that individually seemed minor, but collectively demonstrated sustained campaign of harassment and intimidation. Park compiled 43 separate documented incidents, Keller said, turning the tablet so Maya could see the timeline. Garrett initiated 31 of them, with Morrison and Hayes participating in 26. Senior Chief Reynolds witnessed at least 12 incidents and failed to intervene. Multiple junior personnel joined the harassment after it became socially acceptable within their peer group. Maya scanned the documentation with professional detachment, seeing her own experiences transformed into evidence through Park's meticulous investigation. The lieutenant had captured photographs, witness statements, email exchanges, and official reports that together painted a devastating picture of institutional failure to protect a veteran whose service couldn't be disclosed. "What consequences are you recommending?" Maya asked. Keller's expression hardened. "Garrett will receive administrative separation from Naval Special Warfare. His actions constitute sustained harassment of a special operations veteran and created hostile work environment that violated multiple regulations. Morrison and Hayes will receive official reprimands and reassignment to non-NSW units. Their participation was extensive enough to warrant permanent removal from special operations community." The severity of these consequences reflected how seriously the military treated harassment of any veteran, but especially harassment of someone whose service involved classified operations. Garrett's career was effectively over, ended not by combat failure, but by his inability to recognize that silence sometimes indicated classified credentials rather than fraudulent claims. Reynolds will receive formal counseling, and his fitness reports will reflect failure to maintain appropriate work environment, Keller continued. He's not being separated because he didn't initiate the harassment, but his career advancement is compromised. Multiple junior personnel who participated will receive counseling and monitoring for patterns of similar behavior. Wilson spoke from his position near the door, adding base-level consequences. "I'm implementing mandatory training on working with personnel who have classified backgrounds. Every member of this command will complete certification on proper protocols for situations where service credentials can't be fully disclosed. This should have been standard procedure already, but we're correcting that failure immediately. Maya absorbed these consequences without visible reaction. She'd operated in spaces where mistakes meant deaths rather than administrative separation, which gave her different perspective on career-ending paperwork. But she recognized that these consequences served institutional purpose beyond individual punishment, sending message that harassment based on assumptions about service credentials wouldn't be tolerated. Keller shifted to the more complicated question. Your current assignment is compromised, obviously. Once word spreads beyond this base that your unit rather than civilian contractor, your operational utility in similar cover positions decreases significantly. I've been in contact with your command, and they're evaluating options for your next assignment. Maya had anticipated this outcome from the moment Keller announced her background publicly. Cover positions worked only as long as the cover remained intact. Once burned, an operator either transitioned to different cover or moved into roles where their actual credentials became asset rather than liability. Were the options under consideration? She asked. Keller outlined 3 possibilities. First, reassignment to training role where her credentials would be acknowledged rather than hidden, working with special operations students who needed her expertise. Second, transition to liaison position coordinating between different special operations units, where her cross-service experience added value. Third, return to operational status with unit for assignments that required her specific skill set. Each option represented different trajectory for her career. Training meant stability and acknowledgement, but distance from operational work. Liaison meant political navigation and coordination challenges. Return to operations meant going back to spaces where her life depended on skills that degraded, if not constantly maintained. I need time to consider, Maya said. These decisions affect the next decade of my career. Keller nodded understanding. You have 30 days of administrative leave while the investigation concludes and while your command determines optimal placement. Use that time to decide what you want next, because you've earned the right to choose rather than simply accept assignment. The conversation shifted to practical matters. Maya would remain on base through the weekend to provide statement for the formal investigation, then depart on approved leave. Her equipment and personal effects would be secured during her absence. Park would serve as her point of contact for investigation updates, and Wilson would handle any administrative requirements. Keller stood to leave, but paused at the door with final observation. I told you in Karachi that you had the instincts and composure to build a long career in special operations. 9 years later, that assessment stands confirmed. Whatever you decide for your next assignment, you'll excel at it, because that's who you are as an operator. After Keller departed, Wilson remained with Maya to discuss immediate logistics. His respect for her had increased exponentially over the past hours. Recognizing that she'd maintained professional performance under sustained harassment while protecting information he hadn't possessed clearance to access. I should have investigated the situation earlier, Wilson admitted. The patterns were visible if I'd been paying attention. A contractor with your demonstrated expertise, receiving harassment from active duty personnel, and refusing to defend herself in ways that would have been natural if she was actually civilian. The pieces were there, and I didn't assemble them quickly enough. Maya's response carried no accusation. You initiated inquiry through proper channels, which triggered Admiral Keller's visit. The system worked, just not as quickly as any of us would have preferred. But operational security sometimes requires accepting situations that shouldn't be tolerated, because revealing the truth compromises missions that matter more than individual comfort. Her words reflected philosophy that sustained deep cover operators through assignments that isolated them from support structures most service members took for granted. They endured situations that regulations should have prevented, because the alternative meant exposing operations that affected national security. Maya had lived that philosophy for 6 months while Garrett's harassment escalated, maintaining her cover until external authority forced revelation. Park entered the conference room at 1700 with completed incident documentation and witness statements compiled for formal investigation. She handed Maya a tablet showing the full report, her expression carrying mixture of vindication and regret that the evidence had been necessary at all. 47 people provided statements. Park said, "Most supported your account and expressed regret that they didn't intervene earlier." Several junior personnel admitted participating in harassment after it became normalized within their social groups. The pattern documentation is comprehensive enough to support all recommended consequences. Maya reviewed the statements with clinical detachment, seeing her experience through other people's perspectives. Some witnesses described incidents she'd forgotten, minor harassments that hadn't registered as significant individually but contributed to hostile environment that affected her daily work. Other statements revealed conversations she hadn't heard, gossip and speculation about her background that spread through base communities faster than facts ever traveled. One statement caught her attention. A junior SEAL trainee had written 3 paragraphs describing how he'd initially joined Garrett's mockery, but later recognized that Maya's calm responses and consistent professionalism suggested genuine confidence rather than defensive posturing. He'd stopped participating after watching her correct the breaching charge placement with such immediate precision that he understood her knowledge came from extensive practical experience. That trainee will become good operator someday, Maya observed quietly. He learned to read competence through behavior rather than surface credentials. That's a skill that separates effective special operations personnel from people who just complete training. Park added one final piece of information. The base photographer's images from today's demonstration are being reviewed by public affairs. Several photographs captured the moment Admiral Keller examined your breaching tool and the expression on Garrett's face when he realized his error. Those images effectively document the entire reversal in visual format. Maya understood the implications. Those photographs would circulate through military communities, becoming cautionary tale about the dangers of assuming someone's credentials based on limited information. Garrett would become example used in training scenarios. His public humiliation transformed into teaching moment about respecting all veterans regardless of whether their service could be fully disclosed. The meeting concluded with administrative details about Maya's departure schedule and investigation participation requirements. She left the conference room as daylight faded across the Pacific, walking through a base that now viewed her completely differently than it had that morning. Personnel who'd participated in harassment avoided eye contact or offered awkward apologies. Others showed newfound respect that felt hollow because it depended on external validation rather than recognizing her competence before authority confirmed it. Maya reached her quarters and began preliminary packing, sorting equipment and personal effects while contemplating the 3 career options Keller had outlined. Training appealed to her desire to pass on hard-won knowledge, but meant accepting that her operational days were largely finished. Liaison work would use her experience coordinating joint operations, but involved politics she'd always avoided. Return to operations meant going back to the only work she'd ever truly excelled at, but required acknowledging that she might not survive the next mission the way she'd survived Karachi. The breaching tool sat on her desk, its modified housing catching light from the setting sun. 5 operators carried similar tools, scattered across assignments that would never be publicly acknowledged. 2 operators were dead, their names on a memorial wall that didn't specify which classified operation had killed them. Maya traced the serial number with her thumb, remembering the weight of the tool during the Karachi breach and the sound of explosions that had killed men she'd trained beside. 30 days of leave stretched ahead, time to decide whether she wanted to keep carrying that weight forward or whether 9 years of classified operations had earned her the right to step back into roles where survival wasn't measured in whether she made it through each mission alive. Keller had given her choice, which was itself a form of respect that acknowledged her service and recognized that operators who'd proven themselves deserved agency in determining their own futures. Maya packed the breaching tool last, wrapping it carefully before securing it in her equipment case. Whatever she decided about her next assignment, the tool would come with her as a reminder of what she'd survived and what she'd lost. Some pieces of gear carried too much history to ever be left behind, regardless of whether the operator moved forward into new missions or stepped back into roles where those memories could finally begin healing into something other than constant operational readiness. Lieutenant Sarah Park spent Saturday morning interviewing the final witnesses for her investigation report, compiling testimony that would determine the professional futures of multiple service members. Her office had become command center for documentation that spanned 6 months of harassment, transformed from careful unofficial observation into formal inquiry backed by an admiral's direct involvement. The interviews revealed patterns Park had suspected but couldn't prove until people felt safe speaking honestly. Junior personnel describe how Garrett's mockery of Maya had created permission structure for broader disrespect, how initial reluctance to participate gave way to joining the harassment after it became socially rewarded within their peer groups. Several witnesses expressed genuine remorse, recognizing they contributed to hostile environment without questioning whether their assumptions about Maya's background were accurate. One particularly damning interview came from Petty Officer Second Class Jennifer Martinez, who worked in the equipment bay adjacent to Maya's workspace. She described the incident from 3 months earlier where Garrett had deliberately damaged a piece of Maya's gear, then blamed Maya for improper storage when she reported the damage. Martinez had witnessed the actual incident but remained silent because speaking against a SEAL carried social and professional costs she wasn't willing to pay. Park documented Martinez's statement with careful precision, adding it to evidence that demonstrated Garrett's harassment extended beyond verbal mockery into deliberate sabotage. This crossed threshold from creating uncomfortable work environment into active interference with Maya's ability to perform her assigned duties, elevating the severity of recommended consequences. By noon, Park had compiled 93 pages of witness statements, incident documentation, and timeline analysis. The report painted a comprehensive picture of sustained harassment campaign that multiple people witnessed, fewer people challenged, and command structure failed to address until external intervention forced action. Park's investigation would become case study in institutional failure to protect personnel with classified backgrounds, used in future training to prevent similar situations. She delivered the completed investigation to Commander Wilson at 1300 hours. Wilson reviewed the executive summary while Park waited, his expression darkening as he absorbed the full scope of what had occurred under his command. The investigation documented not just Garrett's actions, but systemic failures that had allowed the harassment to continue unchecked for 6 months. "This is damning," Wilson said quietly, "not just for Garrett and his friends, but for everyone, including myself, who saw pieces of this pattern and didn't intervene effectively. We failed Chun repeatedly, and the only reason consequences are happening now is because an admiral personally knew her background and forced the issue." Park nodded agreement. The investigation recommends institutional changes beyond individual discipline. Mandatory training on classified personnel protocols, clear reporting mechanisms for harassment that don't require victims to reveal information they're not authorized to disclose, and regular command review of civilian contractors who demonstrate expertise beyond their official credentials. Wilson made notes on his tablet, already drafting implementation plans for recommendations that should have been standard procedure. The base would become model for proper treatment of personnel with classified backgrounds. Not because they'd handled Maya's situation correctly, but because they'd failed so completely that corrective measures became impossible to ignore. While Park and Wilson processed investigation findings, Maya conducted her own final tasks before departure. She spent Saturday afternoon in the equipment bay performing maintenance on demolitions gear, completing work that would ensure safe operations after she left. Several personnel approached her during this work, offering apologies that range from genuine remorse to uncomfortable obligation. One young SEAL trainee named Roberts waited until others had departed before approaching Maya's workstation. He participated in early mockery of her gear, but stopped after the breaching charge incident, recognizing that her corrections demonstrated knowledge no fraud would possess. His apology carried weight of someone who'd learned difficult lesson about judging people based on assumptions. "I believe Garrett because he was a senior SEAL and you were a contractor," Robert said quietly. "I didn't think about whether his assumptions were actually based on facts. I'm sorry for contributing to making your assignment here harder than it should have been." Maya paused her maintenance work to give Roberts her full attention. His apology was more thoughtful than most she'd received, showing genuine processing of his error rather than simply trying to avoid association with Garrett's consequences. "You learned something important," Maya told him. "Competence shows through behavior and performance, not through rank or visible credentials. The best operators I've worked with were often the quietest ones, people who let their actions speak because they had nothing to prove. Remember that as you progress through your career." Roberts nodded, absorbing advice from someone whose operational experience he now understood exceeded his instructors. He departed with visible relief, grateful for forgiveness he probably didn't entirely deserve, but needed to continue developing into the operator he hoped to become. Maya finished her equipment maintenance as sunset approached, securing tools and closing out inventory logs with a thoroughness that had marked all her work. The bay felt different now, charged with awareness of her actual background rather than assumptions about civilian contractor limitations. She'd spent 6 months in this space absorbing harassment while maintaining professional performance. And now she was closing that chapter with equipment properly maintained and no outstanding responsibilities. Commander Wilson found her completing final paperwork at 1800 hours. He carried a bottle of bourbon and 2 glasses, unofficial gesture that acknowledged conversations happening outside formal command structure. They moved to Wilson's office, where privacy allowed discussion that couldn't occur in public spaces. "Admiral Keller called this afternoon," Wilson said as he poured drinks. "The investigation results were forwarded to Naval Special Warfare Command and your unit chain of command. Both organizations are taking the findings seriously, implementing changes that extend beyond this base." Maya accepted the glass, recognizing the gesture as Wilson's attempt at an inadequate apology for failing to protect her when his command responsibility required it. She appreciated the intent, even while understanding that administrative consequences for Garrett didn't undo 6 months of daily harassment. "Your unit command wants you to know they're proud of how you maintained operational security despite sustained pressure," Wilson continued. Keller specifically mentioned that most operators would have broken cover within the first month. Holding it for 6 months while continuing professional performance demonstrates why you were selected for this assignment originally. Maya sipped the bourbon, letting its warmth settle before responding. The assignment served its purpose despite complications. "I gathered intelligence on training evolution, identified equipment improvement opportunities, and maintained presence in community that needed observation. The harassment was operational cost that came with the territory." Wilson's expression suggested he didn't entirely accept this pragmatic assessment. "Still, you shouldn't have had to endure what Garrett put you through. His actions and my failure to stop them earlier represent breakdowns we're working to ensure don't happen again." They discussed Maya's 3 career options over the next hour, Wilson offering perspective from someone who'd navigated 30 years of military service across multiple specialties. Training roles provided stability and impact, shaping next generation of operators. Liaison positions offered influence over coordination and policy. Return to operations meant accepting mortality risk that increased with every deployment. "What would you choose?" Maya asked. Wilson considered carefully. "If I had your background and your operational record, I'd probably choose training. Not because operations don't matter, but because passing on what you've learned multiplies your impact. One operator can complete maybe 100 missions over a career. One trainer shapes thousands of operators who complete hundreds of thousands of missions. The math favors training if you measure impact rather than just direct action." Maya understood his logic, but knew the calculation wasn't purely mathematical. Operations provided clarity that training couldn't match, clear objectives, and measurable outcomes. Training involved patience, repetition, and watching students make mistakes you'd learn to avoid through painful experience. The impact might be greater mathematically, but the personal satisfaction was different. The conversation wound down as night settled fully across the base. Wilson walked Maya back toward her quarters, their path taking them past the demonstration area where her confrontation with Garrett had reached its climax just 36 hours earlier. The space looked ordinary now, giving no indication that someone's career had ended there or that truth had emerged with enough force to reshape institutional policy. Lieutenant Park intercepted them near the administration building, carrying final paperwork Maya needed to sign before her departure. The documents formalized her statement, acknowledged her review of investigation findings, and authorized release of certain information to appropriate authorities. Maya signed each page with practiced efficiency, her signature transforming personal experience into official record that would outlive everyone involved. Park handed Maya a business card with her contact information. If you need anything during your leave or after, reach out. You shouldn't have had to handle this situation alone, and I want you to know that not everyone at this command failed to recognize what was happening. The gesture was small, but meaningful, acknowledgement that some people had tried to help even when institutional structures made intervention difficult. Park's investigation had ultimately validated Maya's experience and forced consequences, which represented success, even if it came later than any of them preferred. Maya returned to her quarters for the final night on base, her packing mostly complete and her departure scheduled for early Sunday morning. She lay on her rack reviewing the 3 career options, weighing Wilson's advice against her own instincts about what she needed versus what made strategic sense. Training meant stepping back from operations permanently, accepting that her combat days were essentially finished. Liaison meant navigating politics and coordination challenges that frustrated her preference for direct action. Operations meant going back to spaces where she'd lost friends and nearly died multiple times, accepting that survival odds decreased with each additional mission. The breaching tool sat in her packed equipment case, 5 pounds of modified steel that represented both what she'd survived and what she'd lost. Choosing operations meant continuing to carry that weight forward into situations where it might end up in someone else's hands after she didn't come back. Choosing training or liaison meant the tool became artifact rather than active equipment, memorial to past service rather than preparation for future missions. Maya understood she had 30 days to decide, but she already knew which option called to her despite Wilson's mathematical logic about impact multiplication. Some operators were built for training and coordination, able to step back from direct action into roles where experience shaped others. Other operators were built differently, finding purpose and clarity only in operational spaces where their skills determined immediate outcomes. She'd spent 9 years becoming the second type of operator, and 30 days of leave wouldn't change that fundamental truth about who she was and what gave her life meaning. The only question was whether she'd admit that to herself quickly or spend the leave pretending she might choose differently before ultimately accepting what she already knew. Sunday morning arrived with Pacific dawn casting long shadows across a base that had been fundamentally changed by events of the previous week. Maya Chan would depart, carrying her gear and her questions, leaving behind investigation report that would reshape institutional policy and serve as cautionary tale about the costs of assuming someone's credentials based on limited information. Garrett would face separation proceedings that would end his SEAL career before it truly began. And everyone involved would carry forward lessons learned about respect, assumptions, and the dangers of judging veterans whose service couldn't be fully disclosed. Lieutenant Park's investigation report reached Naval Special Warfare Command headquarters Monday morning, triggering review processes that extended far beyond the individual personnel involved. The document landed on desks where policy decisions affected thousands of special operations personnel, and the failures it documented demanded systemic response rather than simply punishing Garrett and his accomplices. Captain Rebecca Morrison commanded the personnel division responsible for integrating classified operators into roles requiring cover status. She read Park's 93-page report with growing concern, recognizing that Maya Chen's experience represented broader pattern rather than isolated incident. The report revealed gaps in protocols, inadequate training for command personnel, and absence of reporting mechanisms that would allow classified operators to seek help without compromising their covers. Morrison convened Working Group Tuesday morning, pulling together representatives from legal, operations, personnel management, and security divisions. The group's mandate was clear: develop comprehensive protocols preventing repetition of the failures that had allowed Maya's harassment to continue unchecked for 6 months. The working group identified 3 critical breakdown points. First, command personnel lacked training recognizing signs that contractors might hold classified backgrounds requiring special consideration. Second, no reporting mechanism existed for harassment victims who couldn't reveal information necessary to defend themselves. Third, periodic review processes failed to flag patterns suggesting classified personnel were experiencing difficulties that operational security prevented them from reporting through normal channels. Over 3 days of intensive work, the group developed new protocols addressing each failure point. Commands receiving personnel with heavily redacted service records would receive classified briefings, providing sufficient context to recognize when those personnel needed protection without compromising specific operational details. Harassment reporting mechanisms would include confidential channels allowing classified personnel to report through security officers who held appropriate clearances. Quarterly reviews would examine workplace dynamics around any personnel whose backgrounds included extensive redactions, with trained observers looking for patterns indicating problems. The protocols would be implemented across Naval Special Warfare first, then expanded to Joint Special Operations Commands where similar situations could arise. Maya Chen's experience, documented with Park's meticulous precision, would become foundation for institutional change, preventing future operators from enduring what she'd absorbed while maintaining her cover. While Naval Special Warfare developed new protocols, Maya's unit command conducted parallel review of how they'd handled her assignment. Colonel Sarah Martinez led the assessment, examining whether unit procedures had adequately prepared Maya for the isolation and harassment that deep cover assignments sometimes generated. Martinez had commanded the unit element during the Karachi operation where Maya earned her breaching tool. She'd watched Maya develop from promising young operator into seasoned veteran across 4 deployments, and she felt personal responsibility for the situation Maya had endured at the Naval Special Warfare facility. The unit's review identified different failures than Park's investigation had documented. Pre-assignment psychological evaluation hadn't adequately assessed Maya's resilience under sustained social pressure as opposed to combat stress. Support mechanisms during the assignment had been minimal, with quarterly check-ins insufficient to identify deteriorating situation before it reached crisis point. And extraction protocols existed for physical threats, but not for psychological warfare that deep cover operators sometimes face from the very communities they were assigned to observe. Martinez drafted new requirements for deep cover assignments. Operators would receive enhanced psychological preparation for isolation and potential harassment. Monthly rather than quarterly check-ins would occur through secure channels, allowing operators to report difficulties without waiting for scheduled reviews. And extraction protocols would be expanded to include situations where cover was maintained, but operational effectiveness was compromised by hostile work environment. The unit would also develop new criteria for when to burn an operator's cover rather than allowing harassment to continue. Maya's situation had reached point where revelation became necessary, but the decision had come from external intervention rather than unit command recognizing the problem independently. Future assignments would include clearer guidelines about acceptable costs for maintaining cover versus circumstances demanding revelation regardless of operational impact. These institutional changes emerged from Maya's documented experience, transforming her 6 months of harassment into catalyst for protecting future operators in similar situations. She wouldn't know about most of these changes during her administrative leave, but they represented acknowledgement that her silence and resilience had served purposes beyond her individual assignment. Admiral Keller personally briefed Congress on the incident during classified session Wednesday afternoon. The briefing wasn't about Maya specifically, but about broader challenges integrating female special operations personnel into communities that sometimes question their legitimacy. Maya's case provided concrete example of how harassment based on assumptions could affect operational effectiveness and undermine national security by creating hostile environments for valuable assets. Congressional response was immediate and forceful. Representatives demanded accountability not just for individual harassers, but for command structures that failed to protect classified personnel. They authorized increased funding for training programs addressing integration challenges and mandated annual reporting on harassment incidents involving special operations personnel. Keller left the briefing with mixed feelings. Maya's experience had generated positive changes, but those changes came at cost of exposing her background and potentially ending her operational utility in certain assignments. The briefing itself had required revealing classified information to legislators who would use it for policy purposes, further widening the circle of people who knew details about operations that were supposed to stay buried. Back at the Naval Special Warfare Facility, consequences for individual personnel moved through administrative processes with bureaucratic inevitability. Garrett received notification Thursday that separation proceedings would begin within 30 days. The charges included conduct unbecoming, harassment of a veteran, and creating hostile work environment. His SEAL career would end not through combat failure, but through sustained campaign against someone whose credentials exceeded his own. Morrison and Hayes learned their reassignment orders Friday morning. Both would transfer to non-special operations units, where their careers could theoretically continue, but would lack the prestige and opportunity that NSW assignments provided. Their participation in Garrett's harassment campaign would follow them through fitness reports and reputation networks that ensured future commanders would know why they'd been removed from special operations community. Senior Chief Reynolds received formal counseling that stopped short of separation but effectively ended his advancement prospects. His failure to intervene when he witnessed harassment violated leadership responsibilities that senior enlisted personnel were expected to maintain. The counseling would appear in his record permanently, signaling to promotion boards that he'd failed critical tests of protecting personnel under his supervision. Multiple junior personnel received verbal and written counseling documenting their participation in creating hostile environment. These consequences were lighter than what Garrett's group faced, but they established pattern that would affect future evaluations and opportunities. The message was clear. Participating in harassment carried professional costs regardless of whether you initiated it or simply joined because it was socially acceptable. Commander Wilson implemented the new protocols developed by Naval Special Warfare Command, beginning with mandatory training for all personnel. The training covered recognizing classified backgrounds, understanding that silence might indicate operational security rather than fraud, and proper reporting mechanisms for situations where normal channels couldn't address problems involving classified personnel. Lieutenant Park delivered portions of the training personally, using Maya's case as an anonymous example of how assumptions about credentials could create situations that damaged individuals, degraded unit effectiveness, and violated values the military was supposed to uphold. The training was uncomfortable for participants who recognized their own behavior in the documented patterns, but discomfort was precisely the point. Change required acknowledging failures rather than simply moving past them. The base photographer's images from the demonstration, where Keller revealed Maya's background, circulated through special operations communities despite efforts to maintain operational security. The photographs became teaching tools in leadership courses, showing the moment when assumptions collided with reality and careers ended through errors in judgment rather than combat failures. One particular image captured the instant Garrett realized his mistake, his face showing shock and horror as he processed that he'd spent months harassing someone whose operational credentials exceeded his own. That photograph appeared in training materials with caption asking simple question: How well do you really know the people you work with? And what assumptions are you making about their backgrounds based on incomplete information? Maya remained unaware of most institutional changes occurring in response to her documented experience. She departed the base Sunday morning and spent her first week of administrative leave in deliberate isolation, processing 6 months of sustained harassment and deciding what she wanted from the next phase of her career. She rented a cabin in the Cascade Mountains, remote enough that cell service was unreliable and human contact was optional. The isolation was therapeutic after months of being watched, judged, and harassed by people who thought they understood who she was based on assumptions rather than facts. The cabin provided space to decompress without maintaining any persona beyond her actual self. Maya spent her days hiking mountain trails and her evenings cleaning the breaching tool with meditative focus. The maintenance didn't require daily attention, but the ritual provided structure and reminded her of who she'd been before the Naval Special Warfare assignment complicated her identity with layers of cover and misdirection. On her 8th day in the cabin, Maya made her decision about the 3 career options Keller had outlined. She drafted an email to her unit command, brief and direct in the way operational communication always was. The email requested return to active operational status, acknowledging risks, but affirming that training or liaison roles would waste capabilities that were best deployed in direct action contexts. She explained her reasoning with characteristic precision. Training required patience for repeated instruction that frustrated her preference for immediate progression. Liaison required political navigation that diverted energy from operational focus. Direct action provided clarity of purpose and measurable outcomes that matched how she understood her own value and contribution. The email concluded with acknowledgement that this choice meant accepting mortality risk that increased with each deployment. Maya understood statistics, knew that operators who returned to combat repeatedly eventually encountered situations they couldn't survive. But she also understood herself well enough to recognize that stepping back into safer roles would feel like slow death through boredom and disconnection from work that gave her life meaning. She sent the email without second-guessing, then returned to her cabin maintenance tasks. Her unit command would process the request and either approve her return to operations or assign her elsewhere based on their assessment of organizational needs versus her preferences. But she made her choice clear, which was all operators could do when faced with decisions about their futures. The sun set over the Cascades while Maya cleaned her gear and contemplated what came after her 30 days of leave expired. Institutional changes were happening in response to her experience, though she wouldn't learn details until much later. Consequences were being delivered to personnel who'd harassed her, though she felt no particular satisfaction in their career damage. And somewhere in classified spaces, her next assignment was being planned by people who understood that some operators were built for direct action regardless of risks that safer choices would avoid. Maya Chun had maintained her cover for 6 months despite sustained harassment, demonstrated operational security under pressure that broke most people, and ultimately been vindicated by an admiral who remembered her performance under fire 9 years earlier. Now she was choosing to return to the work that had defined her adult life, accepting that this choice might mean her breaching tool would eventually pass to another operator who'd carry it forward in missions she wouldn't survive to complete. Admiral Keller returned to the Naval Special Warfare Facility 2 weeks after his initial intervention, arriving unannounced on a Tuesday morning to observe implementation of the new protocols his investigation had generated. Commander Wilson met him at the gate with visible tension, understanding that this follow-up visit would determine whether the changes had been superficial compliance or genuine institutional reform. The mandatory training on classified personnel protocols had been completed by all base personnel during Maya's administrative leave. Keller requested to observe a session being delivered to newly arrived SEAL students, wanting to see how the lessons from Maya's experience were being translated into education for the next generation of operators. The training instructor was Senior Chief Ramirez, the same explosives specialist who'd witnessed the range confrontation between Maya and Garrett. Ramirez had taken the lessons personally recognizing his own failures to intervene effectively, and he brought that understanding into his delivery with intensity that made the young SEALs pay attention. Ramirez used the photographs from the demonstration without identifying Maya by name, protecting operational security while showing visual evidence of how assumptions could catastrophically wrong. He walked the students through the progression of events, from initial dismissal through escalating harassment to the moment when an admiral's recognition reversed everything Garrett had believed. The lesson you need to absorb, Ramirez told the class, is that silence doesn't always mean someone has nothing to say. Sometimes it means they're not authorized to say it. Respect that silence instead of interpreting it as weakness or fraud. The quietest person in your unit might be carrying credentials and experience that exceed everyone else present. One student raised his hand with question that showed he'd missed the point. But sir, how are we supposed to know if someone's silence is operational security versus actual fraud? Stolen valor is a real problem. Ramirez's response was immediate and sharp. You don't get to make that determination based on your gut feeling or because someone's gear looks suspicious. If you have genuine concerns about credentials, you report through proper channels to people with clearance to investigate. You don't organize harassment campaigns based on assumptions. What Garrett did wasn't protecting the community. It was destroying his own career through arrogance and poor judgment. Keller watched the exchange with approval, recognizing that Ramirez had internalized the lessons and was transmitting them effectively. The training wasn't perfect, but it represented genuine attempt to prevent future operators from repeating Garrett's mistakes. After the session concluded, Keller pulled Ramirez aside for private conversation. You're teaching this well, Keller told him. You understand the stakes because you witnessed the situation firsthand. That authenticity comes through in your delivery. Ramirez's expression carried regret that still hadn't fully processed. I should have intervened sooner, sir. I saw what was happening, and I told myself it wasn't my business. That Chun could handle herself. I was wrong, and now I'm trying to make sure these students don't make the same mistake I did. Keller acknowledged the accountability with a nod of respect. Learning from failures is how we improve as individuals and institutions. Your willingness to own your mistake and teach others makes you a more effective instructor than someone who never failed in first place. The conversation shifted to practical implementation of the new reporting mechanisms. The base had established confidential channel through the security office where personnel with classified backgrounds could report harassment without revealing information they weren't authorized to disclose. The system wasn't perfect, but it provided option that hadn't existed during Maya's assignment. Wilson joined them for facility tour, showing Keller the physical changes that accompanied procedural updates. Posters in common areas reminded personnel about proper protocols for working with contractors who might hold classified credentials. Anonymous reporting boxes had been installed in multiple locations, providing additional channels for raising concerns without fear of retaliation. These changes are a good start, Keller said as they walked through the equipment bay, where Maya had spent 6 months absorbing harassment. But real test will come when next classified operator arrives and faces similar challenges. Will the new protocols actually protect them, or will social dynamics override institutional rules the way they did with Chun? Wilson had no confident answer to that question. We've changed procedures and delivered training, but changing culture takes longer than 2 weeks. I can enforce consequences for violations, but I can't force people to genuinely respect personnel whose credentials they can't verify. That has to develop through experience and leadership modeling over time. Keller accepted this realistic assessment. He'd spent 3 decades in military service and understood that institutional culture changed slowly through consistent reinforcement rather than single policy implementation. Maya's case would influence that culture by serving as cautionary example, but preventing the next similar situation required sustained attention rather than assuming the problem was solved. Meanwhile, Garrett's separation proceedings moved toward conclusion in administrative offices removed from the operational spaces where his career had ended. He sat across from a Navy legal officer Wednesday afternoon, reviewing documents that would finalize his removal from service. The separation was characterized as general under honorable conditions, allowing him to retain some benefits, but marking his record with reason for removal that would affect future employment opportunities. The legal officer explained the terms with bureaucratic precision. Your separation is based on conduct unbecoming and sustained harassment of a veteran with classified service record. You're not being charged criminally, but the administrative action removes you from naval special warfare effective immediately. You have right to appeal, but I'll tell you honestly that appeals in cases with this level of documentation rarely succeed. Garrett signed the papers with hands that showed slight tremor. Everything he'd worked toward over 6 years of service was ending because he'd misjudged one person's background and organized campaign around that misjudgment. The fairness or unfairness of his separation was debatable, but the reality was absolute. His SEAL career was finished at age 26, ended not by combat injury or training failure, but by his own poor judgment and worse execution. Morrison and Hayes received their reassignment orders the same day, both transferring to conventional Navy units where their SEAL training would be wasted on duties that didn't require or value special operations expertise. The assignments were professional death sentences, acknowledging their skills while removing them from communities where those skills could be properly employed. Lieutenant Park compiled final report on investigation outcomes, documenting all consequences and institutional changes that had emerged from Maya's case. Her report showed 12 personnel receiving various levels of discipline, from Garrett's separation through Reynolds's counseling to junior personnel receiving verbal warnings. The report also detailed new protocols, training programs, and policy changes implemented across Naval Special Warfare Command. Park's executive summary concluded with observation that would guide future similar situations. The Chun case demonstrates that protecting classified personnel requires proactive systems rather than reactive responses. Waiting for harassment to become crisis before intervening damages individuals, compromises operational security, and undermines institutional credibility. Commands must recognize and address concerning patterns before they escalate to levels requiring admiral intervention. The report was forwarded to Naval Special Warfare Group 1, Special Operations Command, and congressional oversight committees that had requested information about military responses to harassment involving special operations personnel. It would become reference document in policy discussions, teaching materials, and legal proceedings for years to come. Admiral Keller departed the base Thursday afternoon, satisfied that genuine changes were being implemented even while recognizing that cultural transformation required sustained effort beyond his single intervention. He'd ended Maya's immediate harassment, forced accountability for perpetrators, and catalyzed institutional reforms. But individual operators would still face challenges that policies couldn't entirely prevent, and future situations would test whether the lessons from Maya's experience had truly been absorbed. Before leaving, Keller made one final call to Maya's unit command. He spoke with Colonel Martinez, providing assessment of Naval Special Warfare's response and recommendations for how unit might better prepare operators for similar assignments. The conversation acknowledged shared responsibility for situation that had required external intervention to resolve. Martinez informed Keller about Maya's request to return to operational status rather than accepting training or liaison assignments. Keller wasn't surprised by her choice, having seen enough operators to recognize those who were built for direct action regardless of risks. He endorsed her request, noting that some of the most effective special operations personnel were those who chose combat assignments with full understanding of costs involved. The call concluded with both officers acknowledging that Maya's next assignment should avoid situations requiring extended cover that isolated her from support structures. Direct action missions with her actual unit credentials acknowledged would play to her strengths while avoiding circumstances that had made her naval special warfare assignment so challenging. Back in her mountain cabin, Maya received encrypted email Thursday evening from Colonel Martinez confirming that her request for return to operations had been approved. The email outlined timeline for her return, training refresher requirements, and preliminary information about her next assignment. Details were sparse for security reasons, but the message conveyed that UNIT valued her choice and would deploy her capabilities appropriately. Maya read the email twice, feeling mixture of relief and anticipation that came from knowing her immediate future. She had 2 more weeks of administrative leave, then would report for training refresher that would prepare her for operational deployment. The assignment would be different from her Naval Special Warfare posting, using her actual credentials rather than cover identity, and placing her with unit personnel who understood her background without requiring explanation. She responded to Martinez with brief acknowledgement, confirming her timeline and requesting equipment updates for gear that had evolved during her 6-month civilian contractor assignment. The email exchange was professional and concise, reflecting communication style developed over years of classified operations where every word was chosen for precision rather than social warmth. Friday morning brought different message, this one from Lieutenant Park providing update on investigation outcomes. Park's email included summary of consequences, description of new protocols, and personal note thanking Maya for maintaining operational security despite circumstances that justified breaking cover earlier. The email concluded with observation that Maya's documented experience would help protect future operators facing similar challenges. Maya appreciated Park's thoroughness and genuine concern, but the investigation outcomes felt distant from her current focus on preparing for operational return. Garrett's separation and the institutional changes mattered for future personnel, but they didn't alter Maya's own trajectory or address the fundamental question of whether deep cover assignments were sustainable for operators whose backgrounds made them targets in communities that valued credentials over competence. She drafted response thanking Park for the investigation work and noting that the new protocols might prevent others from enduring what she'd experienced. But Maya knew that policies and training could only accomplish so much against social dynamics that rewarded conformity and punished difference. The military was slowly improving its treatment of female special operations personnel, but progress measured in policy updates didn't eliminate challenges that operators like Maya would continue facing throughout their careers. The Cascade Mountains provided temporary refuge from those challenges, space where Maya could decompress and prepare mentally for returning to work that defined her identity and gave her life purpose. In 2 weeks, she'd leave this isolation and return to operational tempo that left no room for processing or healing. She'd carry her breaching tool forward into new missions, accepting that each assignment might be her last, but choosing that risk over alternatives that felt like slow professional death through safety and disconnection. 3 months after Admiral Keller's intervention, Maya Chun stood in a different training facility, conducting her first official instruction as acknowledged unit operator rather than civilian contractor, hiding credentials behind redacted files. The students before her were newly selected special operations personnel, drawn from multiple services and beginning the advanced training that would prepare them for missions that officially didn't exist. The training facility was located in an undisclosed location, secured behind layers of classification that made the Naval Special Warfare Base look transparent by comparison. Here, Maya could wear her actual credentials and discuss operational experience without maintaining cover that invited the harassment she'd endured for 6 months. The difference was profound, transforming her from isolated contractor absorbing mockery into respected instructor whose background commanded immediate attention. She demonstrated breaching techniques using the modified MC4 that had ultimately vindicated her at the Naval Special Warfare Facility. The students watched with focused intensity as she explained modifications designed for the Karachi operation, describing how engineering solutions addressed specific tactical problems without revealing classified details about the mission itself. Her instruction carried authority that came from having used these techniques under fire, surviving situations where mistakes meant death rather than training failures. One student, a former Marine named Jackson, asked a question that showed he'd been briefed on Maya's recent experience. "Ma'am, We heard you spent time at a SEAL facility where people questioned your credentials. How did you maintain professionalism when you couldn't defend yourself by revealing your actual background? Maya paused her demonstration, recognizing teaching moment that extended beyond technical breaching skills. She set down the tool and faced the class directly, choosing her words with the precision that characterized all her communication. You maintain professionalism by understanding that your mission matters more than your ego, she said. When operational security requires silence, you stay silent regardless of personal cost. When people make assumptions based on incomplete information, you let them make those assumptions because correcting them would compromise operations that affect national security. You endure discomfort because that's part of the job, and you trust that truth will emerge when circumstances allow. Another student raised his hand with follow-up question. But didn't that situation damage your effectiveness? How can you work properly when the people around you don't respect your expertise? Maya's response drew on lessons she was still processing. It did damage my effectiveness, which is why the situation eventually required intervention. The new protocols being implemented recognize that there's a limit to sustainable cost for maintaining cover. When harassment becomes severe enough to compromise operational performance, revelation becomes necessary even if it burns the cover. The key is having systems that recognize when that threshold is reached rather than waiting until damage is irreversible. She returned to the technical demonstration, but the conversation had shifted the session's focus from pure skills instruction to broader discussion about operating in environments that sometimes challenge operators in ways that combat couldn't match. The students absorbed lessons about institutional navigation, operational security, and the complex calculations involved in maintaining cover while preserving operational effectiveness. After the training session concluded, Maya received message from Colonel Martinez requesting meeting at command headquarters. She arrived at the secure facility to find Martinez reviewing deployment schedules on multiple screens, managing operational tempo that kept unit personnel constantly cycling between training, deployment, and recovery. Martinez looked up from her screens when Maya entered, gesturing her into a chair with expression that suggested both good news and complications. Your instruction reviews are excellent, she said without preamble. Students respond well to your combination of technical expertise and operational experience. The training command wants to keep you in instructor role permanently. Maya had anticipated this possibility. Her recent experience and the institutional changes it had generated made her valuable as instructor who could teach both technical skills and lessons about navigating challenges that female special operations personnel faced more frequently than their male counterparts. But accepting permanent instructor role meant acknowledging that her operational days were essentially finished. What about the deployment we discussed? Maya asked. Martinez's expression confirmed what Maya already suspected. The deployment is still available if you want it, but I'll be honest about the calculation. You got approximately 10 more years of viable operational time based on your age and physical capabilities. You could spend those 10 years running maybe 50 missions, or you could spend them as instructor shaping thousands of operators who will run tens of thousands of missions. The math favors instruction if you measure impact. The same logic Commander Wilson had presented, framed slightly differently, but reaching identical conclusion. Maya understood the reasoning and couldn't argue against it purely on logical grounds. But logic didn't account for the visceral need some operators felt for direct action, the clarity that came from missions with defined objectives and measurable outcomes. I need to think about it, Maya said. Martinez nodded understanding. You've got 2 weeks before the training cycle starts again. Use that time to decide whether you want the deployment or the permanent instructor assignment. Either way, unit benefits from your service. Maya left the headquarters building and walked through the facility compound, watching other operators conduct training evolutions that would prepare them for deployments she might never experience again if she accepted the instructor role. She recognized her own younger self in their intensity, remembering when every exercise felt like preparation for defining moments rather than repetition of skills she'd already mastered. The breaching tool hung from her vest with comfortable weight, 5 pounds of modified steel that had survived Karachi, her naval special warfare assignment, and the confrontation that had ultimately vindicated her credentials. The tool had become more than equipment, transforming into symbol of her service and reminder that silence sometimes carried more weight than any words could convey. Maya spent the next 2 weeks considering her decision from every angle. She spoke with operators who'd made similar choices, seeking perspective from people who understood the pull of operational work against the logic of maximizing impact through instruction. Some operators who'd chosen training expressed satisfaction with their contributions and relief at stepping back from mortality risk. Others admitted they'd never fully adjusted to instructor roles, always missing the clarity and purpose that direct action provided. She also spoke with Keller during his visit to the facility for coordination meetings. The Admiral shared his own experience transitioning from operational command to administrative leadership, acknowledging the difficulty of stepping back from work that had defined his identity for decades. But he'd found different satisfaction in shaping policy and protecting personnel, using his influence to create conditions where future operators could thrive in ways his generation hadn't experienced. Your naval special warfare experience generated institutional changes that will protect operators for decades, Keller told her. Sometimes our greatest contributions come from surviving situations that reveal systemic failures rather than from executing perfect missions that change nothing about how the institution operates. The observation resonated with Maya, though it didn't fully resolve her internal conflict about which role serve her better personally versus which serve the institution more effectively. She understood that some operators were built for instruction and found genuine fulfillment in teaching. She wasn't certain she was one of those operators, but she recognized that her uncertainty itself might indicate she needed to try the role before dismissing it. On the final day of her decision period, Maya cleaned her breaching tool with meditative focus, considering what the equipment represented and what she wanted it to mean going forward. The tool could remain active operational gear carried into combat, or it could become teaching aid used to instruct students about modifications designed for missions they'd learn about only through carefully sanitized examples. She assembled the tool and returned it to her vest, feeling its weight settle against her ribs with familiar comfort. Then she drafted email to Colonel Martinez accepting the permanent instructor assignment, acknowledging that this choice meant stepping back from operational deployments, but recognizing that impact could be measured in different ways beyond direct action missions. The email explained her reasoning with characteristic precision. Training allows multiplication of impact through shaping multiple generations of operators. My operational experience, including recent challenges, provides perspective that benefits students facing similar situations. And permanent instructor status enables me to develop curriculum addressing integration challenges that current training doesn't adequately cover. She concluded with acknowledgement that this decision felt difficult despite its logical soundness, admitting that some part of her would always miss operational work, but accepting that service sometimes meant choosing roles based on institutional needs rather than personal preferences. Maya sent the email without second-guessing, then returned to her quarters to prepare for the next training cycle. She would teach breaching techniques, operational security, and lessons about maintaining professionalism under circumstances that tested operators in ways combat couldn't match. Her students would learn from her technical expertise and from her documented experience enduring harassment while protecting classified information that couldn't be revealed until external authority forced the truth into spaces that depended on plausible deniability. The Naval Special Warfare Facility continued implementing protocols that Maya's experience had generated, training new students about respecting silence and understanding that credentials couldn't always be displayed or discussed. Garrett worked civilian security job, his SEAL career ended by assumptions and poor judgment. And across special operations communities, instructors used photographs from the demonstration where Admiral Keller had revealed the truth, teaching future operators that the quietest person in the room might be carrying experience and credentials that exceeded everyone else present. Maya's story became teaching tool, cautionary tale, and evidence that institutional change could emerge from individual experiences when those experiences were documented with precision that forced acknowledgement rather than allowing quiet burial. She maintained her cover for 6 months despite sustained harassment, demonstrated operational security under pressure that broke most people, and ultimately catalyzed reforms that would protect future operators facing similar challenges. Now she would teach those future operators, passing forward knowledge earned through missions that officially never happened and through harassment that officially shouldn't have occurred. Her breaching tool would remain active equipment, used in instruction rather than combat, carrying forward the memory of Karachi and the legacy of silence that sometimes spoke louder than any public credentials could convey. Maybe you've learned something from Maya's experience about not judging people based on incomplete information, about respecting silence when you don't know what it protects, about understanding that the most dangerous operators are often the ones who don't need to prove anything to anyone. Her story raises questions about how we treat people whose credentials we can't verify, how we balance security with fairness, and whether we've ever misjudged someone whose quiet competence deserved respect we didn't offer. Those questions matter regardless of whether you serve in uniform or simply navigate civilian communities where similar dynamics play out daily. Maya would wonder if her story resonates with experiences you've had or witnessed, whether you've seen quiet strength dismissed as weakness, and if you'll carry forward the lesson that silence sometimes protects truths more important than personal validation.